The War Council had been arguing for exactly 47 minutes when Nathan Cross set down his glass and looked at the room. He did not raise his voice. He did not have to. Nathan Cross had been ruling the Northern Pact Dominion for 8 years, and in that time he had learned something that most kings took decades to discover: that silence, used correctly, was louder than any shout. The argument stopped. 12 people sat around the long oak table at the center of the council chamber. Generals, magistrates, border lords, the head of commerce, each one powerful in their own right, each one wearing the silver crest of the Dominion on their collar. Tonight they had been debating, arguing, and increasingly raising their voices over a topic that had nothing to do with trade routes, border security, or the winter grain supply. They had been arguing about Nathan's personal life. Harold Fenn, the head of the Royal Council, was 61 years old and had served 3 kings without ever being permanently removed from his post. He was white-haired, broad-shouldered, and possessed of the particular confidence of a man who had survived enough political storms to believe he understood them all. He straightened in his chair when Nathan's eyes landed on him. "Say it again," Nathan said. His voice was completely even. Harold cleared his throat. "Your Highness, the Dominion requires stability. An unmated Alpha King creates uncertainty at a time when we cannot afford it. The Eastern Territories are watching our leadership structure very carefully. The Southern Pacts have sent 2 diplomatic inquiries in the last quarter. Both, if you read between the lines, contain questions about succession. There are families prepared to present candidates, Highness. Good families, strong bloodlines. Alphas and betas from established. Harold." The name landed like a closed door. Harold stopped. "I have told you," Nathan said, rising slowly to his feet, "on 3 separate occasions, that my bond status is not a council matter. I have been clear about this. I have been consistent about this, and yet here we are, 47 minutes into a meeting that should have been about the Eastern grain shortage and the new border checkpoint proposal. And instead, this table has been debating my personal choices as if I am not sitting at the head of it." He let the silence breathe for a moment. "This meeting is over." No one argued. That was the thing about Nathan Cross. By the time he said a thing was over, it was already over. You could feel it in the air, the particular settling of energy in a room when the most powerful person in it had made a final decision. The council members gathered their papers and left with the quiet efficiency of people who had been dismissed, often enough to do it gracefully. Harold was the last to go. He paused at the door, turned slightly, and opened his mouth as if he had one more thing to add. Nathan looked at him. Harold closed his mouth and left. Colin Drake materialized at Nathan's side the moment the chamber emptied, as he had been doing for 4 years. Colin was Nathan's personal advisor, and the only person in the palace who had ever managed to be both completely loyal and completely honest at the same time. He was lean and tired-looking in the way of someone who had been managing a king's schedule since before such management was fashionable, and he carried a worn leather journal everywhere he went. Not for notes specifically, but as a habit, the way some people carry a sense of purpose. "You know Harold is already writing a formal petition," Colin said, falling into step beside Nathan as they moved into the corridor. "I assumed. He has 3 families lined up, 2 alphas and 1 beta. All from old bloodlines, all politically useful, all, I'm sure, perfectly fine people. I'm sure they are." "Nathan," Colin said the name the way someone places a hand on a shoulder. "I am not on Harold's side, you know that. But the pressure is real, and it is not going away. The Eastern Territories question is genuine. They are watching, and an unmated king does create questions about succession that our rivals will not politely ignore." Nathan stopped walking. He was standing in the middle of the corridor, beneath a row of oil lanterns that cast the stone walls in warm amber. On the wall at the far end hung a portrait of his father, a large, formal painting, commissioned in the 2nd year of his father's reign. His father looked confident in it, certain, standing in the way of a man who knew exactly where he belonged in the world. He had known, Nathan thought. His father had always known, because he had been mated young and happily, to a woman who had chosen him before he was king, before any of the power or the weight of it existed. They had built something real together. Nathan had grown up inside the warmth of that bond. He had understood, from childhood, what it felt like when 2 people genuinely chose each other. He had also watched what happened when that bond was severed. His father had gone to the eastern border to defend his people during a conflict that no one had seen coming, and had not come back. And the warmth had gone with him, and the kingdom had needed someone to step into that emptiness immediately, without time for grief, without time for adjustment, without anything, except the sharp, cold requirement of responsibility. Nathan had been 24 years old. He had stepped in. He had not stopped stepping in since. "I am not afraid of a bond," he said quietly, still looking at the portrait. "I am afraid of selecting one. I am afraid of treating something that should matter deeply, like a political requirement to be fulfilled." He paused. "My father did not select a mate. He found one. There is a difference." Colin was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There is. I know the difference exists." Nathan started walking again. "I just have not found what I am looking for yet." Colin wrote something in his journal. He did not share what it was. Nathan's study was the one room in the palace that felt genuinely like his, not like a king's room, like his. Over 8 years he had filled it with the things that mattered to him. Books on pack history, a detailed map of every territorial dispute the Dominion had navigated in the last century, a brass telescope near the tall window, because he had always found the night sky more honest than people, and a small portrait of his parents on the corner of the desk that he had placed there himself, rather than having a servant hang it. The fire was low. The desk was covered in paperwork, petitions, trade proposals, border reports, civic requests from 3 different city districts. Nathan sat down, pulled the nearest stack toward him, and began. He was good at this, at moving through the necessary things without losing clarity, at keeping the pace of obligations steady enough that the harder, quieter feelings did not find the gaps. 8 years of practice. 8 years of choosing work over stillness, because stillness, in the early years, had been a dangerous place for a young king who had lost his father and inherited an empire, and had not been given time to process either. He worked for 3 hours. Around midnight, he set down his pen and looked at the small portrait on the corner of the desk. His parents, young, laughing at something outside the frame of the painting. They had been mated for 6 years by then. You could see it in the way they stood, not performing closeness, but simply existing inside it, the way people do when they have chosen each other so many times that the choice has become something like breathing. Nathan looked at that painting for a long time. He was not a man who used the word lonely. It felt self-indulgent, applied to a person with a kingdom and a council, and 300 responsibilities, demanding his attention at any given hour. Lonely was for people with empty days. Nathan Cross had never had an empty day in his life. And yet there was something in the late hours, in the particular silence of midnight in the palace, when the fires burned low, and the city outside the window glittered quietly below, something that felt like the shape of an absence, not a lack of people. The palace had never been short of people, an absence of something more specific, someone who knew what was behind the silence. He stood at the window for a while, looking at the city below. 300,000 people going about their lives under the shelter of a kingdom that he had kept stable and solvent, and, by most measures, just. He was proud of it, genuinely proud of it. He had worked for every inch of what the Dominion had become under his rule. He just had not planned to do all of it alone. He pulled himself away from the window. He had a morning report due at 7, and a full council review at 9. He went to bed. The efficiency report arrived 3 days later. It was a standard quarterly assessment of palace operations, and Nathan read through it the way he read everything, thoroughly, quickly, flagging what required follow-up and dismissing what did not. He was 4 pages in when a single paragraph made him stop. The Royal Records Hall had experienced a critical retrieval failure during the eastern border negotiations the previous month. Several key historical documents, records of a territorial boundary agreement from 80 years ago that would have directly supported the Dominion's negotiating position, had been misfiled and could not be located when needed. The advisor handling the retrieval had not reported the failure at the time. By the time an alternative source was found, 2 full days of negotiation had been lost. 2 days, because of misfiled documents. Nathan read the paragraph twice. He set down the report and looked at Colin. "I am going to the archives," he said. Colin looked up from the stack of Border Patrol logs he was reviewing. "I beg your pardon?" "The Royal Records Hall. Tomorrow morning. I am going myself." Nathan, you have 4 city council appointments, a security briefing, the grain shortage response report, and a formal dinner with the Western Trade Delegation, which cannot be moved because it was already moved twice and... Move the dinner. Combine the first 2 appointments. The security briefing can be moved to the afternoon. I will review the grain report in the carriage. Nathan picked up his pen. Tell the head archivist I will be there at 9. Colin stared at him for a long moment. Then he picked up his journal and began writing. He knew, from years of experience, that when Nathan Cross made a decision that seemed slightly irrational, it usually turned out to have been exactly right. In the lower district of the city, in a small apartment above a tea shop, a young man named Eli Haynes was reading a 300-year-old book about pack governance and making notes in the margins, in the kind of small, precise handwriting that suggested a person who treated words as things to be used carefully rather than scattered freely. He was 27 years old. He had worked in the Royal Records Hall for 3 years. He was careful, thorough, and almost entirely invisible. That was not an accident. Eli Haynes had spent 5 years building a life that kept him safe. A life in which he was useful but unnoticed, present but unremarkable, valued for his work but never closely examined. He had chosen the archives specifically because they were the kind of place where a person who was good at their job could spend years without anyone in power thinking about them at all. That was what he needed. The medication on his bedside table was part of that safety. He took it every night without fail, and again each morning, and in the 5 years since he had started taking it, it had never once let him down. It was expensive. It required a specific kind of doctor who asked very few questions and charged accordingly. Eli paid the cost without complaint every single month, and considered it not an expense but a necessity, the same category as rent and food and the shoes he wore every day, non-negotiable, essential. Because what the medication suppressed was something that, if it surfaced in the wrong environment, could change everything about his life. He was an Omega. In the Northern Pack Dominion, that fact carried the weight of a law that was generations old. Omegas were not mistreated, technically. They were not imprisoned or harmed. The law had evolved over the centuries to a place where the language used about them was almost gentle, protected, supported, guided. Omegas were said to be naturally suited to bonded life, naturally inclined toward partnership, naturally gifted with the kind of depth that made bonds strong. As if the word natural made it a kindness rather than a restriction. Eli had understood, from the moment he presented as an Omega at 19, that the world had a plan for him that had nothing to do with what he actually wanted. He would be registered. He would be assigned legal guardian status until he bonded. He would be expected to bond with an alpha or beta of appropriate standing, and that bond would define his legal identity, his residential status, his occupational rights, everything, all of it. His entire life, restructured around a designation he had not chosen. He had looked at that future very clearly, and then he had walked away from it. He had started on the suppressants within weeks of his presentation, before he was registered, before the system had time to close around him. He had found a quiet city in the eastern part of the Dominion where no one knew him, built a paper history for himself as a beta, and started again. 3 years later, he had moved to the capital and applied for the position at the Royal Records Hall. He had been here ever since. He was not unhappy. That was the thing that might have surprised people, if anyone had known enough about him to be surprised. Eli Haynes was not a sad person. He was not bitter or defeated or secretly waiting to be rescued. He had built something real, a job he was good at, a life that was quiet and stable and entirely his, a small apartment with a big window and a collection of historical texts that he genuinely loved. He had peace. He had made it himself. He closed his book at 10, set his alarm for 6, and turned off the light. He did not know that the next morning, the king of the Northern Pack Dominion would be walking through the doors of the building where he worked. He did not know that the life he had built so carefully was about to encounter something it was not built to withstand. He just knew that the tea was cold, and the book was good, and the city outside was making the familiar sounds of a place settling into night. He closed his eyes. In the morning, everything would be the same. For now. Eli was awake 10 minutes before his alarm. He always was. He had been waking before his alarm since he was 19 years old, when the part of his mind responsible for vigilance had quietly decided it was too important to leave to mechanical timing. His eyes opened in the dark of his apartment, and he lay still for a moment, listening. The building above the tea shop was old enough to have its own sounds, pipes that clicked when the temperature dropped, a particular settling groan from the third step on the staircase, the neighbor's cat that moved across the roof around 4 in the morning with more purpose than seemed necessary for an animal. Eli had catalogued all of these sounds over 3 years, until they were as familiar as his own breathing. He registered them now, automatically, and found nothing unusual in any of them. He got up. The apartment was small but ordered. That was perhaps the most accurate way to describe everything about Eli Haynes. Small but ordered. Not small in the diminished sense, but small in the deliberately contained sense, the way someone builds a room they can actually maintain, rather than a space too large to manage. His bookshelves were organized by subject and then by publication date within each subject. His kitchen had exactly what he needed and nothing extra. His closet held 8 versions of essentially the same outfit: dark trousers, a collared shirt, a jacket that was 1 size too large across the shoulders. He took his medication with a glass of water. He stood at the kitchen window while the kettle heated and watched the lower district wake up below him. He liked this part of the morning, the particular moment when the streets below were mostly empty but beginning to hum with the first sounds of movement. A bakery cart rolling across the cobblestones, a pair of city workers in orange vests walking the perimeter check, the lights coming on in the laundry 2 buildings over. The world before it was fully awake was somehow more honest. He made his tea, drank it standing at the window, and then sat at his small desk to review the day's catalog priorities before leaving. He had a list. He always had a list. The third-floor document vault needed the new acquisition items sorted and cross-referenced with the existing pre-settlement records. The mold damage report from the East Wing humidity issue needed to be followed up with the building manager. 2 reading requests from academic researchers had come in late yesterday and needed to be pulled before 10. He went through the list methodically, noting estimated time for each task, noting dependencies, and potential complications. He was halfway through when a knock at the door interrupted him. He opened it to find the woman from the apartment across the hall, Clara Potts, who worked at the city records office and had been his closest neighbor and, in the limited sense he allowed for such things, his closest friend for 2 years. Clara was 29, red-haired, possessed of an opinion on virtually everything, and one of the few people whose company Eli found genuinely comfortable rather than merely tolerable. "Did you hear?" she said immediately, without preamble, which was how Clara Potts always began conversations. "Hear what?" "The king is going to the archives today." She leaned against the doorframe. "My colleague at the Palace Administrative Office told me this morning. Nathan Cross himself, going to the Royal Records Hall at 9. Eli looked at her. "Why?" he said. He kept his voice even. "Apparently there was some kind of retrieval failure during the eastern border negotiations last month. Documents that should have been findable were not, and it cost the Dominion 2 days in the talks. He found out about it and decided to conduct a personal review. That seems excessive." "He is Nathan Cross," Clara said, as if that explained everything, which in the Dominion it largely did. "Apparently he takes efficiency personally." Eli said something appropriate. He agreed it was unexpected, expressed mild professional interest, told Clara he would need to leave soon. She went back across the hall. He closed the door. He stood in the middle of his apartment for a moment. The king, coming to the archives. Eli was not a person who panicked easily. Panic was a luxury he had trained himself out of years ago because panic created visible responses, and visible responses drew attention, and attention was the one thing he could not afford. When alarming things happened, he responded with analysis. He identified the specific nature of the threat, assessed its probability, and determined the best practical response. He applied that process now. Nathan Cross visiting the archives was not, in itself, a threat. Kings visited buildings all the time. Royal inspections were not unusual events. There was no specific reason to believe Nathan would pay attention to any individual archivist. The hall had 14 staff members. Eli was one of 14. He worked in the back section, away from the main entrance. He would likely not be in the same space as the king at all. He assessed the probability of personal interaction, low. He assessed the risk to his concealment if interaction did occur, medium to high. His suppressants were working as expected. He had taken his morning dose. He was not in an elevated emotional state, not yet. He would keep his composure, keep his head down, do his work, and in all probability, spend the entire royal visit cataloging third-floor records without ever coming within 20 meters of the king. This was manageable. He picked up his bag, adjusted his jacket, the one that was slightly too large, which was not a fashion choice, and left for work. The Royal Records Hall was a building that Eli had come to genuinely love over 3 years, which was not something he had expected when he first took the position. He had chosen it for practical reasons. It was respected work, it required precision and discretion, it paid reasonably well, and it had the crucial quality of existing at the very edge of the palace complex without being truly inside it, close enough to be credible, far enough to be forgotten about by the people who mattered. But the building itself had turned out to be something else entirely. It was 4 stories of pale stone, built 200 years ago in the style of the Old Dominion architects, who believed that a place of records should feel permanent without feeling oppressive. The windows were tall and narrow, letting in long slanting lines of morning light that moved across the reading room floor as the day progressed. The smell inside was paper and old binding glue, and the particular dry coolness of a space that maintained controlled humidity for preservation purposes. The shelves were mahogany, ceiling height, accessible by rolling ladders that ran on brass rail systems. Eli loved the rolling ladders. He loved the smell of the old documents. He loved the specific satisfaction of finding something misfiled and returning it to its correct location, of seeing the catalog make sense in a way it had not before. He loved the absolute quiet of the back section in the early morning, before the reading room opened to researchers, and the building began to produce the low hum of occupied purpose. He arrived at 7, as always, 2 hours before anyone else. He unlocked the staff entrance, turned on the work lights in the back section, hung up his bag and jacket, and went to his desk. The list, the priorities, third-floor vault, mold damage follow-up, research requests. He began. For 2 hours, the world was exactly what it always was: documents and order, and the quiet satisfaction of work done well. At 8:40, the head archivist arrived. Basil Ford was 55, round-faced, cheerful in the particular way of someone who had spent 30 years among books and had mostly stopped being surprised by people. He was a decent man, one of the few Eli worked for who did not require managing. Basil cared about the archives more than he cared about hierarchy, which made him easy to work with, and occasionally a source of mild chaos when he forgot that not everyone shared his priorities. This morning, Basil Ford was clearly not cheerful. He was clearly something closer to agitated. "Eli," he said, finding him in the back section with a stack of new acquisitions. "Have you heard?" "The king is coming at 9, Eli said. "I heard this morning." "Right, yes." Basil ran a hand through his graying hair. "I need the front reading room in perfect order. I need the catalog index up to date on the main desk. Not the working index, the public one. I need the East Wing access log on visible display, because apparently there was a question about the retrieval failure, and I do not want it to look like we are hiding anything. Because we are not hiding anything. We simply had a temporary filing misalignment and—" "Basil." Eli looked at him steadily. "I will take care of the reading room and the public index. You should make sure the East Wing log is ready." Basil visibly settled. "Right. Yes. Good. Thank you." He started toward the East Wing, then turned back. "Keep yourself available, would you? He may want to speak with the cataloging staff, and you are the one who actually understands how the back section systems work." Eli felt something shift very slightly in his chest, a small, controlled tightening. "Of course," he said. He turned back to his work. Available. The king might want to speak with the cataloging staff. He recalculated. Probability of personal interaction, medium. He reviewed his morning dose again mentally. Adequate. He was composed. His presentation was exactly what it had been every day for 3 years. Beta, archivist, professional, unremarkable. He was fine. He went to prepare the reading room. At 8:58, Eli was at his desk in the back section when he heard the main door of the records hall open. He heard Basil's voice, a slightly elevated, careful version of Basil's normal cheerful tone. He heard another voice answer. He did not look up. He kept his pen moving across the acquisition log. A date, a document title, a classification code. The routine mechanics of the job, that had kept him safe for 3 years. The voice in the entrance hall was low, measured, and carried the particular quality of someone who was not trying to project authority, but had it anyway. The way some voices carry in a room, not because they are loud, but because they are certain. Eli knew, without looking up, that Nathan Cross had just walked into the building where he worked. He kept his pen moving. He told himself, very clearly and firmly, that this was going to be fine. He also noted, somewhere beneath the logic and the analysis and the careful composure, that his hand had not shaken once. That was good. He repeated it to himself. His hand had not shaken. Everything was fine. Basil Ford gave the kind of guided tour that a man gives when he is trying to simultaneously demonstrate competence and not draw attention to the specific recent incident that prompted the visit. He took Nathan Cross through the main reading room first, the tall windows, the mahogany shelves, the public catalog index, explaining the classification system with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely loved classification systems and occasionally forgot that his audience might not share that enthusiasm. Nathan listened. He asked 2 questions, both precise, both about the retrieval failure. Basil answered them honestly. Nathan nodded and moved on. He was not here to humiliate anyone. He was here to understand a system and fix what was broken in it. That was how he approached most things. The reading room connected to the east wing via a wide corridor lined with reference shelves. Nathan walked through it with Colin at his shoulder and Basil slightly ahead, gesturing at the shelving system and explaining the cross-referencing protocol that had been in place for 20 years and had worked well until a new intake of documents the previous winter had been processed by a temporary staff member who had applied the wrong classification tier to 3 categories simultaneously. Nathan stopped at the door to the back section. "Who manages this area?" he said. Basil turned. "Our senior catalogist, Eli Haynes. He has been with us for 3 years. Extraordinary precision. I have never seen anyone work with historical classification at the level he does." "Is he here?" "He is, yes. Would you like—" "I would like to see the back section." Basil opened the door. The back section was exactly what its name described, the less public, more functional heart of the building. Where the reading room was designed to impress, the back section was designed to work. Rows of dense shelving, work tables with good lighting, the soft background sound of the ventilation system that kept humidity at the correct level for preservation. A rolling ladder on its rail on the far wall, and at the main work desk, a young man sitting with his back partially to the door, bent over an acquisition log. He had dark hair, cut short. He was wearing a dark jacket that looked slightly too large across the shoulders. His handwriting, visible from across the room, was very small and very precise. He turned when the door opened. He stood. Nathan looked at him. There was nothing specifically notable about the young man who stood up from that work desk. He was of average height, with steady dark eyes, and the kind of face that was arranged in carefully neutral lines, not deliberately cold, just contained, like someone who had spent a long time not offering his expression to anyone who had not earned it. But something happened in the air, between the moment the door opened and the moment Nathan walked through it. Nathan noticed it the same way he noticed weather changes, a shift in the atmosphere that he could not immediately identify, but that registered, somewhere beneath conscious thought, as significant. He filed it away and walked into the room. "Your Highness," the young man said. His voice was quiet, controlled. He inclined his head briefly, correctly, not a full bow, not a casual nod, but the specific angle, appropriate for a professional member of palace staff, acknowledging the king in a working environment. "This is Eli Haynes," Basil said. "Our senior catalogist." "Mr. Haynes." Nathan nodded. "What are you working on?" Eli's eyes moved to the acquisition log. "New intake from the Eastern Registry. Documents relating to the boundary survey records from 80 to 90 years ago. I am cross-referencing them with the existing pre-settlement archive to create a unified access record." Nathan was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Those are the same record categories that could not be located during the Eastern border negotiations." "Yes," Eli said. "I am aware. I flagged the misclassification 6 weeks ago in an internal report. The documents were transferred to the correct section immediately." A very brief pause. Had the retrieval request come 3 weeks later, the correct files would have been in their expected location. Nathan looked at him. Why did not the advisory team know the files had been moved? The internal report was not shared with the advisory team. That was a communication gap between this office and the Diplomatic Affairs Division, not a gap in the catalog itself. Another pause. The catalog was correct. The communication was not. Nathan was quiet. Then he said, "That is a useful distinction." Eli said nothing. His expression had not shifted once. Nathan asked 3 more questions about the catalog system. Eli answered all of them with the same precision. Clear, direct, without embellishment. No performance, no nervousness. Just information. Cleanly presented. Nathan took note of that. He asked Colin to record the answers. Basil hovered helpfully. The inspection of the back section took approximately 15 minutes. Nathan thanked Basil, told him he would have a formal review recommendation sent by the end of the week, and turned toward the door. The collision happened in the connecting corridor. Nathan had been half reading a note that Colin had just handed him. He was turning the corner from the back section into the East Wing passage at the same moment that Eli, who had finished a separate task and was returning to his desk via the same route from the other direction, turned the same corner from the opposite side. The impact was not hard. Both of them pulled back quickly, but the distance between them, for one unexpected moment, went from non-existent to 2 steps in the space of a single second. Nathan caught himself against the shelf on the right wall. Eli caught himself against the opposite one. They were standing very close, closer than either of them had expected, the combined momentum of 2 people walking with purpose having delivered them to a proximity that neither had planned. Nathan looked at Eli. Eli looked at Nathan. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds. 3 seconds was nothing. 3 seconds was how long it took to read a headline, to recognize someone across a room, to decide whether you wanted another cup of coffee. 3 seconds should not have meant anything. But Nathan Cross spent the rest of that day occasionally stopping what he was doing to remember exactly how those 3 seconds had felt. He could not explain it. He was not the kind of man who let unexplainable things sit unexamined. He kept reaching for the right category, uncomfortable, strange, and finding that none of them fit. The feeling was not any of those things. It was closer to the specific sensation of recognizing something you did not know you had been looking for. He did not say this to Colin. He did not say it to anyone. He apologized briefly for the collision. Eli said it was entirely his fault. They moved past each other. The inspection continued. Nathan reviewed the rest of the building with full attention. He thanked Basil, shook his hand, and left. In the carriage on the way back to the palace, Colin reviewed his notes, and Nathan looked out the window. "Useful morning," Colin said. "Yes." The catalogist was impressive, the senior one. Nathan looked at him. "Eli Haynes," Colin said, glancing at his journal. The answers he gave about the misclassification were more precise than anything the diplomatic advisory team produced in their post-negotiation review. He had already flagged the error himself before the failure occurred. There is a process gap between that office and diplomatic affairs that no one had caught. I noticed. Should I arrange a follow-up review with him specifically? Nathan returned his attention to the window. The city moved past. Market stalls, residential blocks, the wide avenue that led from the archive district back toward the palace. The air had the particular quality of a late autumn morning, clear and cool and slightly sharp, the kind of air that made everything feel more defined than usual. "Schedule it," he said. Colin wrote something in his journal. Nathan said nothing else. That evening, he stood at his study window for longer than usual. He was trying to identify what was persisting, staying present, refusing to categorize properly and be filed away. He had an efficient mental system for most things. Information came in, was assessed, was placed in the correct category, and then became available for retrieval when needed, without cluttering the active workspace. The morning was not filing. Specifically, 3 seconds in a corridor was not filing. Specifically, the expression of a young archivist who had answered a king's questions with complete clarity and zero performance, and then walked into him, in a narrow corridor, and looked up with the darkest, most guarded eyes Nathan had ever seen, on a person who was technically just at work. He could not identify why this was significant. He only knew that it was. He stayed at the window until the city went properly dark, and then he went to bed, and he lay there for an amount of time that was unusual for him, because Nathan Cross had always been someone who fell asleep quickly and woke early. And tonight the dark of his room felt larger than it normally did. He thought about questions he had not asked. He thought about answers that had been given with perfect precision and not one syllable of extra information. He went to sleep eventually. In the morning, he told Colin to move the follow-up review to the following Monday. Then he thought for a moment and said, "Actually, move it to Thursday." Colin looked at him. "I want to look at the communication gap between the archive and the diplomatic division," Nathan said. "Thursday is better." Colin wrote it down. The follow-up was for Thursday. That was 4 days away. Nathan found Thursday suddenly slightly too far away, which was a feeling he could not readily explain and therefore did not attempt to. Thursday came. And then it came again in a different form, because the follow-up review identified 3 additional process improvements that logically required Nathan to return the following week to assess implementation. And the week after that, a new territorial records request from the Border Commission required direct consultation with the senior catalogist regarding historical boundary documentation. And the week after that, there was the matter of the pre-settlement archive index, which Eli had apparently been rebuilding from scratch over the past 2 years as an unofficial project, and which Colin, having discovered it, had described to Nathan as the most comprehensive thing he had seen in that building. So Nathan came back. And then he came back again. And by the 5th visit, Basil Ford had stopped being surprised to see the king and had started simply putting the good tea service in the back section on days when he knew Nathan was coming, which was the closest a head archivist could come to rolling out the welcome mat while maintaining professional dignity. What no one in the palace discussed openly, though several people discussed it in the way that people discuss things they cannot prove, was that Nathan Cross began scheduling archive visits on days that had no obvious administrative reason for them. The retrieval failure had been addressed. The communication gap had been resolved with a 3-page protocol amendment that Eli had drafted and Nathan had approved in under an hour. The pre-settlement index review had been officially completed, and yet the king kept coming back. He told Colin it was about building stronger palace archive coordination. Colin wrote it down without comment, because he was very good at his job, and his job occasionally required letting his king believe that the cover story was more convincing than it was. What happened in the back section over those weeks was not dramatic. It was actually very quiet. Quiet in the way that things can be quiet while being the most important thing happening in a person's life. They talked. Not all the time. Nathan had work to do when he visited, and Eli had work to do regardless of whether the king was there, and the first 2 visits were conducted with the kind of professional formality that kept a respectful distance between a king and a palace staff member. But there were moments, a question Nathan asked about a historical document that led to a longer answer than expected, a comment Eli made about the classification inconsistency in the pre-settlement records that turned into a 20-minute conversation about the political reasons behind the original misclassification, and in those moments, something shifted slightly. Not rapidly, not dramatically, just slightly. The way temperature changes, gradually enough that you do not notice it until you realize you have taken off your jacket. Nathan found himself looking forward to the visits in a way that had nothing to do with administrative efficiency. He found himself asking questions that were slightly adjacent to what he had actually come to review, because the answers Eli gave to questions were unlike the answers he received from anyone else. Not more polished, less polished, more honest. Eli did not tell Nathan what he thought he wanted to hear. He told Nathan what he actually thought, and he did it in a way that was careful and precise without being cold. One afternoon Nathan asked, in the middle of reviewing the territorial records, why the boundary survey documents had originally been classified under economic records rather than territorial records. Political convenience, Eli said. He was standing at the shelving unit, replacing a document in its proper sleeve. In the period immediately after the southern expansion, the administration needed the boundary surveys to read as trade determinations rather than territorial claims. It made the expansion more palatable to the eastern territories, who were watching the Dominion's growth carefully. Economic documents are less threatening than territorial ones. He paused. It was effective politics. It also meant that anyone looking for the documents 30 years later, under the correct classification, would not find them, because they had been filed under the wrong one on purpose. Nathan looked at him. And the person who did that? Worked for your grandfather's administration, and died 40 years ago. So there is not much to be done about accountability. Eli turned from the shelf. But the misclassification has caused retrieval failures for 3 generations of archivists, and at least 2 diplomatic situations I have identified so far. If you want me to write a report on it. Write the report, Nathan said. I will have it by Friday. Sooner. A very brief pause. Wednesday then. Thank you. It was not a remarkable exchange. It was a conversation between a king and an archivist about historical document classification. But Nathan caught himself replaying it later that evening, not because of the content, but because of something in the way Eli operated, the particular quality of a mind that was clear and precise and completely honest, and not performing anything for anyone. The people Nathan spent most of his time with were all, in varying degrees, performing competence, or loyalty, or impressiveness, or political alignment. Even Colin, the most genuine person in the palace, was performing a role, carefully and well. That was what the palace was, a place of function dressed in form. Eli Haynes apparently had not received that information. Eli, for his part, was managing. That was the word he used internally, and he used it deliberately, because managing implied control, and control was what this situation required. He told himself this each morning before he left for work. He told himself this when he heard the carriage in the courtyard that meant the king had arrived again. He told himself this when Nathan walked into the back section, and the air did the thing it had been doing since the first day. That particular atmospheric shift that Eli did not examine too closely, because examining it too closely would require acknowledging things he had decided not to acknowledge. He was professional. He answered questions with precision, and nothing extra. He maintained the correct amount of distance while being appropriately available. He kept his desk between them when possible, which was not always possible, and was becoming less possible over time, because Nathan had a habit of simply pulling up a chair and sitting across from him like a man who had decided the desk was a shared workspace rather than a boundary. You cataloged these yourself, Nathan said one afternoon, reviewing the pre-settlement index that Eli had been quietly rebuilding over 2 years. Yes. This is 200 years of records. 214, going back to the original establishment treaty. There were significant gaps in the cross-referencing, particularly in the records from the transition period between the 3rd and 4th administrative eras. I rebuilt the index from primary documents. Nathan was quiet for a moment, looking at the index. Then he said, How long did this take? 2 years, ongoing. It is not finished yet. You did this as an unofficial project. It needed doing. No one asked you to do it. No. Nathan looked at him, not with the assessing gaze of a king evaluating a staff member's work, with something more specific, the look of a person who has been told something that changes slightly the way they see another person. Why? He said. Eli met his eyes. He did it without flinching, which had become slightly harder to do over the past few weeks, and which he was not examining too closely. Because the archive is supposed to be a complete record, Eli said. If the record has gaps, it is not complete, and an incomplete record is just an organized version of forgetting. Nathan said nothing for a moment. Then he said, That is the best definition of historical preservation I have ever heard. It is just accurate, Eli said. He turned back to his work. He did not look at Nathan again for several minutes. In those several minutes, his handwriting was slightly less precise than usual, which he noticed and corrected. Clara had opinions. This was not new. Clara always had opinions, but the opinions she had been expressing on their shared landing and in the brief conversations before work had been focusing increasingly on a single topic that Eli found inconvenient. You seem different, she said one evening, when he passed her on the stairs carrying groceries. I seem exactly the same, Eli said. You are walking faster than you used to. I am in a hurry. Eli. She looked at him steadily. She had known him for 2 years and had the particular insight of someone who paid attention to small changes rather than dramatic ones. Something is happening with you. Not bad. I do not think it is bad. You just seem more present, like there is more of you here. Eli looked at her. Work has been busy, he said, with the royal reviews. Clara shifted her bag from one arm to the other. The king has been back a lot. The retrieval failure generated a significant administrative review process. That is 5 visits in 3 weeks. Administrative reviews are thorough. Eli. "Good evening, Clara," he said, and went inside. He set the groceries down on the kitchen counter. He stood for a moment with his hands on the edge of the counter. Clara was right that he seemed more present. He had noticed it himself, which was the problem. He had built his life around a very specific kind of absence, not absence of purpose or work or capability, but an absence of anything that pulled him toward feeling too much. He had kept the volume of his inner life turned low, deliberately, because that was how you stayed safe when you were hiding something that people were not allowed to know. He picked up an apple from the grocery bag. He was managing. He made dinner. He reviewed tomorrow's priority list. He took his evening medication with the kind of careful deliberateness that meant he was paying extra attention to it. He sat at his desk for a while before bed and opened his journal, the worn leather one, the private one. He wrote 3 lines. Then he closed it. He went to sleep. He was managing. The 5th visit ended differently from the previous 4. Nathan had been reviewing a set of territorial boundary documents that Eli had pulled for him, and they had been working through them across the large work table in the back section, a natural collaborative arrangement that had developed gradually over the visits without either of them explicitly deciding it should. Nathan reviewed and asked questions. Eli explained context and cross-referenced sources. The afternoon light shifted across the room as they worked. At some point, the work was done, and the documents were set aside, and neither of them moved immediately. Nathan sat back in his chair and looked at the table for a moment. Then he said, without looking up, "Do you like this work?" Eli glanced at him. The question was unexpected. Not about the documents, not about the archive. Personal. "Yes," he said, carefully. "Very much." "Why archives, specifically?" Eli was quiet for a moment. He thought about giving a professional answer, and then, for reasons he did not examine, did not. "Archives are honest," he said. "The documents do not change depending on who is reading them. They say what they say. A record from 200 years ago does not know it is being reviewed by someone in the present day who might want it to mean something different. It just is what it is." A pause. "I find that restful." Nathan looked at him then. "You find honesty restful," he said. "I find it rare," Eli said. "So yes, when I find it, it is restful." The afternoon light had moved to the far wall. Nathan stood. He gathered his notes. He said something standard about the next review. Eli said something standard in return. Nathan nodded and left. Eli sat at the table after the door closed. He sat there for a full 4 minutes without moving. Then he picked up his pen and went back to the acquisition log. He was managing. He told himself that 3 more times. Then he stopped telling himself, because the 3rd time, he almost did not believe it. It started with small things. That was how Eli noticed it. Not with a dramatic event, but with an accumulation of small signals that his body was sending, and that his medication was no longer fully suppressing. A sensitivity to light that was slightly sharper than usual in the mornings. A restlessness around midday that did not correlate with anything in his work or routine. A heightened awareness of ambient sound in the archive. Not uncomfortable, just more present than it had been 6 months ago. He recognized them. He had read enough about omega biology to understand what he was looking at. His body was not in crisis. It was not failing in any dramatic or visible way. But the suppressants, which he had been taking for 5 years at a stable dose, were no longer covering everything they had previously covered. The medical term was tolerance drift. The body, over time, adapted to medication and required either a dose adjustment or a formula change to maintain the same level of suppression. It happened to everyone who stayed on suppressants long term. He had known it would happen eventually. He had hoped eventually would be further away than this. He sat in the archive one morning, before the rest of the staff arrived, running his hand very slowly across the surface of his work desk, thinking through the practical steps. He needed to contact his doctor. He needed a dose adjustment. It was not an emergency. The signs were early. The gap in suppression was small. No one had noticed anything. He had time to address it properly. He told himself this. He also knew that the reason the tolerance drift was happening now, rather than 4 months ago, or 8 months from now, was almost certainly connected to the fact that his emotional baseline had shifted. Stress elevated the body's natural responses. But stress was not quite the right word for what he was experiencing. Stress would have been manageable. Stress was familiar. What was happening was something more specific and more inconvenient, and he had been not looking at it for several weeks, with the discipline of someone who understood that looking at it would require dealing with it. He looked at it now, alone in the archive at 6:50 in the morning. The reason his suppressants were failing, or beginning to fail, was that something in his carefully ordered, deliberately contained, successfully managed life had started pulling toward a person who sat across from him in the back section twice a week and listened to him talk about historical documents, as if what he was saying was the most interesting thing in the room. That was the truth of it. He sat with that truth for exactly long enough to confirm it was accurate. Then he got up and went to do his work. He contacted his doctor the same day. The appointment was for the following morning. The doctor, a quiet woman named Dr. Vera Holt, who had been managing Eli's suppressant prescription for 4 years, with no unnecessary questions and excellent discretion, reviewed his symptoms, adjusted the formulation, and provided a 2-month supply of the higher dose variant. She told him the adjustment should show full effect within a week. She told him to monitor for side effects, particularly headaches and appetite changes. She told him to come back if the symptoms persisted past the 2-week mark. She did not ask what had caused the tolerance drift. Eli paid for the prescription and left. The new medication worked. That was the good news. By the end of the week, the small signals had quieted. The sensitivity, the restlessness, the heightened awareness, all of it receded back to the baseline that Eli had maintained for years. His composure was intact. His days were ordered. The archive was what it always was, a quiet place where documents were correctly filed and the world outside stayed appropriately distant. The bad news was that none of the external conditions had changed. Nathan was still coming to the archive. The follow-up review process had generated its own momentum, a formal administrative restructuring of how the archive interfaced with the Diplomatic Affairs Division, and Nathan had made clear that he wanted to be personally involved in the implementation. The restructuring, at its current pace, was not going to be properly finished for at least another 6 weeks. 6 weeks. Eli sat with that calculation. He went to the head of Palace Administrative Placements and submitted a formal transfer request. He asked to be reassigned to the secondary archive in the Northern District, a smaller facility that handled civic records rather than royal and historical ones. The position was at the same grade level. The pay was the same. The reason he gave was professional development. He wanted broader experience across different archive classifications. He wrote the request carefully. He was very good at writing carefully. He handed it in on a Tuesday. The request was denied on a Friday. The reason given was operational. The archive restructuring project specifically required the senior catalogist to remain in place for continuity. The request could be reconsidered upon project completion. Eli read the denial form twice. He put it in his desk drawer. He sat for a moment with his hands flat on the desk surface, looking at the drawer. Then he opened the acquisition log and went back to work. He was not in danger. He was not failing. The new suppressants were doing their job. He was composed and professional, and the work was good, and the situation was entirely manageable. He repeated this to himself several times over the following days. On Thursday, Nathan came back. Eli's journal had always been a private discipline. He had started it 2 years into his time at the archive, not because he had thought writing would help with anything specifically, but because he had reached a point where the thoughts in his head were occupying more space than they could productively take up, and writing them down externally had seemed like the most efficient way to create room. He had never shown it to anyone. He had never even described its existence to Clara. It was a worn leather notebook, brown, with a spine that had started creaking from repeated use. He wrote in it in the evenings, in the same small, precise handwriting that characterized everything he did. Mostly he wrote observations, about the archive, about history, about things he had read that surprised him, or confirmed what he already suspected. After the transfer request was denied, the entries changed. They had always been measured. They began, in the weeks following the denial, to be honest instead. He wrote about what he wanted. Not in an abstract or philosophical way, not simply that he wanted to be seen or known, but specifically and practically, with the same precision he applied to document classification. He wrote about what a bond would need to look like, functionally, to be something he would willingly choose. He wrote about what had always frightened him about the bond, as defined by Dominion law, not the closeness of it, but the way closeness, in that framework, became a form of absorption. You stopped being separate. Your legal identity restructured around the bond. Your choices became permissions. He wrote about the difference between being known and being claimed. He wrote, on one particular night, about what it would feel like to want a bond with someone and not have the wanting mean that you were required to become smaller. He wrote about what it would feel like to choose, genuinely choose, with full information and full agency, to trust another person with the truth of what you were. He did not write Nathan's name. He did not need to. The specific weight of what he was describing had a very particular shape, and the shape was not abstract, and Eli was honest enough, in the private pages of a journal no one would ever read, to know exactly what he was actually writing about. He closed the journal and put it in the front pocket of his work bag, which was where he had started keeping it recently, rather than on his bedside table. He told himself it was because the bag was more convenient. He went to sleep. The fire started in the storage annex at 11:15 on a Thursday morning. It was not a large fire. It was not even, technically, a fire. It was an electrical fault in the wall behind the ventilation unit in the north storage room that produced heat and smoke enough to trigger the palace fire response, but not enough to produce actual flames before it was contained. The response was fast, professional, and exactly what it was supposed to be. 2 fire crews from the palace maintenance division arrived within minutes. The ventilation was shut down. The electrical system was isolated. The storage room was checked. No damage to documents. But the smoke had reached the adjacent corridor, and the protocol for any fire incident, regardless of size, was to move all active documents and non-secured materials from the affected wing to safe storage until the area was cleared for occupancy. This meant, at 11:17 on a Thursday morning, that the entire east wing of the Royal Records Hall had to be cleared. Now, everything currently on open desks or in active transfer boxes had to be moved to the secure transfer room on the ground floor for temporary storage. Eli ran. That was not hyperbole. The East Wing contained 40 active acquisition records, 3 ongoing research requests, and a complete month of unprocessed cross-references that had taken him 11 days to compile. He ran because he was the senior catalogist, because the documents were his responsibility, and because he had approximately 20 minutes before the smoke reached the open shelving system. He grabbed the nearest stack of materials from his desk, the acquisition records, the research requests, the cross-reference folders, the transfer boxes that were staged near the connecting corridor. He moved fast but carefully, handling documents with the same precision under pressure that he handled them with on a quiet Tuesday, because panic was expensive and documents were irreplaceable. He filled 3 transfer boxes in 7 minutes. He carried them to the secure transfer room. He went back for the 4th. The 4th box was filled in the remaining time with everything left on the active desk surface, the items that had been in use that morning and had not been returned to their proper shelving locations. Eli moved methodically from left to right across the desk, reference binders, current documentation sleeves, the folder of pending communications that needed to be filed. He was on the 4th pass across the desk when Basil appeared at the door with 2 junior staff members and a 5th box. "The corridor is getting thick," Basil said. "We need to clear now." "One more pass," Eli said. "Eli." 30 seconds. He made the last pass. His hand swept the remaining items from the right side of the desk into the 4th box, the pending communications folder, a small stack of reference cards, a slim-bound notebook that had been sitting at the right-hand corner of the desk surface. He closed the box. He carried it to the transfer room. He stacked it with the others and helped Basil secure the transfer room door. He did not realize, until 3 hours later when the wing had been cleared and he began sorting through the boxes, that the slim-bound notebook he had swept off the desk surface was not an archive document. It was his journal. He sat very still in the secure transfer room for a long time, looking at the sealed 4th box. He went through the timeline very quickly. The boxes had been logged by the front desk clerk when he brought them in. They had been officially entered into the temporary transfer system, which was, in the context of a royal archive with royal administrative oversight, not a purely internal system. Transfer boxes from the archive occasionally made their way to the palace administrative offices for record review, particularly if they contained documents relevant to ongoing royal projects, such as, for example, the administrative restructuring project that Nathan Cross was personally overseeing. His journal had not been labeled as personal property. It had no external marking identifying it as belonging to him. He had never put his name on the outside, because he had never imagined it would need to be identified. He looked at the fourth box. He opened it. The journal was in there, between the pending communications folder and a reference binder. He let out a very quiet breath. He took the journal out, put it in the front pocket of his bag, and resealed the box. The incident was over. No one had seen the journal. No one had opened it. He had caught it in time. He carried the fourth box to the reshelving station, returned to his desk, and sat down. He opened the acquisition log. He reached into the front pocket of his bag for his pen. The journal was not there. He went very still. He went through it again. He had taken the journal out of the box. He had put it in his bag. He had resealed the box. He had carried it to the reshelving station. The reshelving station. He was moving before the thought finished forming, back across the room, to the long wooden shelf that served as the reshelving staging area, where items from transfer boxes waited to be returned to their permanent locations. He found the fourth box. He opened it. The journal was not in the bag pocket, and it was not in the fourth box, and his memory of the transition between opening the box and resealing it had the particular blurred quality of a moment lived under acute stress, which meant there was a gap, and in the gap, something had gone wrong. He checked the adjacent boxes. He checked the reshelving station surface. He checked, with a specific quiet dread, the record of which boxes had already been collected by the palace courier. The fourth box had been collected 12 minutes ago. It had been logged for delivery to the Palace Administrative Filing Office, which routed document packages from active royal projects to the relevant oversight desk, which, for the archive restructuring project, was Nathan Cross's office. He could request the box be returned. He could contact the administrative office, explain there had been an erroneous item included, ask for the return of a non-archived document. This was a perfectly reasonable thing to do, and there was no specific reason it would not succeed. He started toward the communications desk. He stopped. He thought about what the request would look like. A senior archivist flagging an erroneously included item in a delivery to the king's office. Administrative staff would log the request. The request would generate a query. The query would note that the item had already been routed to the king's direct filing system. Someone would need to retrieve it from Nathan's desk or inbox. Someone would note what kind of item had accidentally been included in an official archive delivery. A personal journal. In a world where Eli Haynes was supposed to be a beta archivist with nothing to hide, he stood at the communications desk for a moment. Then he stepped back. He returned to his desk. He picked up his pen. He could not do anything about the journal now. He would wait. If it was returned without being opened, the problem was solved. If it reached Nathan's desk, and Nathan glanced at it and recognized it as personal rather than archival, he stopped that thought. He wrote the date in the acquisition log. He kept working. That night, Nathan's study was quiet. The desk was piled in its usual way. The fire was low. The city outside the window was doing its ordinary nighttime things. Nathan had worked through the evening report, 3 border advisories, a civic petition, and a trade proposal, before he picked up the transfer package that had come from the archive earlier in the afternoon. The package contained what he expected: a set of pending cross-reference records related to the restructuring project, a memo from Basil regarding the fire incident, and some additional documentation related to the East Wing clearance. Underneath the documentation, slightly askew, was a slim leather notebook. Nathan picked it up. There was no label, no title. He opened it to the first page, no name. He turned to a random middle page. He read 3 lines and went still. The handwriting was unmistakable. He had been watching that handwriting for weeks, in acquisition logs and cross-reference notes, and a 200-year index, compiled entirely by hand. Small, precise, the kind of handwriting that belonged to someone who thought carefully before committing anything to a permanent surface. He should have closed it. He knew he should have closed it. He turned to the first page and began reading from the beginning. He read for 2 hours. He did not plan to. He read one entry, then the next. He told himself he would stop at the end of the first section, but the sections connected to each other in the way of a person working through something over time, returning to the same themes from different angles, and the angles were so clear and honest that stopping felt like turning away from a conversation that was actually going somewhere. Eli did not write about himself the way people wrote about themselves in journals. He wrote about ideas, and the ideas were personal. About what honesty felt like when it was rare. About what it cost to build a life that was entirely your own, and what that cost sometimes felt like at midnight, when the city outside was quiet. About a bond. What a bond might look like if it were built on genuine choice rather than expectation. About the difference between being cared for and being consumed. About what it would mean to be truly seen by another person and to choose, deliberately, from a position of full strength rather than need, to let yourself be. Nathan read all of it. He sat in the quiet study for a long time afterward. He thought about a young man who had told him that he found honesty restful because it was rare. He thought about 3 seconds in a corridor. He thought about a person who rebuilt a 200-year record because an incomplete record was just an organized version of forgetting. He picked up his pen. He turned to the last written page of the journal. He wrote one sentence. It was the most accurate thing he had put on paper in 8 years of correspondence and governance and formal communication. He wrote, "I did not know this was possible either." He closed the journal. In the morning, before the staff arrived, he put it back. He placed it on the right-hand corner of the work desk in the back section of the Royal Records Hall, in the exact position it had occupied before the fire incident. He went back to the palace. He sat at his own desk and looked out the window at the city for a long time. He had written one line in someone else's journal without permission. He was not certain it was a wise thing to have done. He was completely certain it was the truest thing he had done in years. The journal was exactly where it had been before the fire incident. Eli saw it the moment he walked into the back section. He saw it and stopped. He had spent all of yesterday and all of last night telling himself that the courier delivery had been an internal route, and that the package had likely been processed by an administrative clerk, rather than reviewed directly by Nathan, and that a slim personal journal mixed into an archive delivery was more likely to have been returned to him unceremoniously than opened. Because why would anyone in a palace administrative office open a personal notebook when they had official documents to process? He had told himself this very methodically, and had mostly believed it by the time he fell asleep. The journal sitting on the exact corner of his desk, where it had been before the incident, told him, with a very quiet and absolute certainty, that it had not been returned by an administrative clerk. Administrative clerks did not put things back in the precise position they had originally occupied. He crossed the room. He sat down. He opened the journal. He turned to the last written page. He read the line. He read it again. He sat with it for a while in the way that people sit with things that are too large to process all at once, not fighting it, not running from it, just letting it exist for a moment, in the space where it had arrived. I did not know this was possible either. The handwriting was different from his, larger, deliberate, the kind of penmanship that belonged to someone who had signed 1,000 official documents and had a particular relationship with the weight of written words. He closed the journal. He put it in the front pocket of his bag. He sat at his desk for approximately 11 minutes without moving. Then he stood up, took off his archive work jacket, put on his regular jacket, and told Basil that he needed to step out for a personal appointment and would be back within the hour. Basil looked at him. In 3 years, Eli had never stepped out for a personal appointment. He had never called in late or asked for flexibility, or been anything other than exactly where he was supposed to be, when he was supposed to be there. "Of course," Basil said carefully. "Take your time." Eli walked out of the archive. He walked across the palace courtyard. He went up the main corridor to the east wing. He knocked on the door of the private study. The door opened and Nathan Cross was on the other side of it, in working clothes rather than formal ones. Dark jacket, collar open, the specific appearance of a man who had been at his desk since early morning. He was holding a document. He looked at Eli. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "You read it," Eli said. It was not a question. Nathan stepped back from the door. "Come in." Eli came in. The study was warmer than he had expected. Books on every wall, a fire that was burning low, the telescope near the window, the small portrait on the desk corner, his parents, he realized, recognizing them from the official portraits in the archive, young, laughing. Nathan closed the door. He set the document he was holding on the desk. Eli stood in the middle of the room. "I owe you an apology," Nathan said. "I read something that was private. I should have recognized it was personal, and returned it without reading it. I did not. I am sorry for that." "Why did you not stop?" The question was honest, in the way that Eli's questions always were. Not aggressive, not accusatory, just direct. Nathan was quiet for a moment. "Because I read 3 lines, and recognized the handwriting, and then could not stop," he said. "That is not an adequate justification, but it is what happened." Eli nodded slowly. He reached into his bag. He took out the journal. He looked at the last written page for a moment, at the single line in different handwriting, and then he looked at Nathan. "You wrote that," he said. "Yes." "What did you mean by it?" Nathan sat down, not on the formal side of the desk, on the chair near the fire. He gestured at the other chair, across from it, and Eli sat. For a moment they just sat. "What you wrote," Nathan said carefully, "about what a bond would need to look like to be something worth choosing. The specific way you described it, not what bonds are, but what they could be, what they should be." He paused. "I have been running a kingdom for 8 years. Every conversation I have had in 8 years about bonding has been either a political negotiation or a personal obligation or someone trying to solve a problem they think I have." He looked at Eli steadily. "What you described in that journal is the first thing I have read that sounded like a reason." Eli said nothing. "I wrote that line," Nathan continued, "because it was the most honest response I could give. Not as a king, just as a person who did not know that particular kind of honesty was written down somewhere." Eli was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I am an Omega." He said it the way you say something that has been a secret for 5 years and has finally reached the point where keeping it is more exhausting than letting it out. Flat, clear, not dramatized. Nathan looked at him. He did not look surprised. Or perhaps he had suspected, or sensed, in the way that alphas could sense things they were not always able to identify, and simply had not had a name for it. "I have been on suppressants since I was 19, Eli said. "I built a paper identity as a beta. I have worked in the archive for 3 years, under that identity. No one in this building knows. No one in this palace knows." He looked at Nathan. "I have been very careful, for a very long time." "Why are you telling me?" Nathan said. It was not the response Eli had expected. He had expected reaction. Protocol. The king's duty-bound response to the discovery of an illegally concealed designation. He had prepared, on the walk across the courtyard, for that version of this conversation. Instead, Nathan was asking why. "Because you read the journal," Eli said, "and you did not pretend you had not, and you wrote back." He looked down for a moment, then back up. "I have been hiding for 5 years. I am very good at it. But I am tired of doing it in front of someone who—" He stopped, started again. "You read what I wrote, about what a bond should look like, about choice, about being seen. And you wrote that one line. And I would rather tell you the truth now, than wait for it to come out in a way I cannot control." The fire burned low. The city was quiet outside the window. Nathan looked at him for a long time, with the particular attention of someone who was listening completely. Not to the words only, but to everything around the words. "The law requires me to report an unregistered Omega working in a palace facility," Nathan said. Eli looked at him steadily. "I know. I am not going to do that." Eli said nothing. "What I am going to do," Nathan said, "is ask you what you actually want. Not what the law says, not what the system expects. What do you want?" The question landed in the room like something permanent. Eli had been asked many questions in his life. He had been asked precise questions about historical documents and classification systems and archive protocols. He had been asked by doctors about symptom management, and by landlords about rental history, and by Basil Ford about cataloging timelines. He had never been asked what he wanted, not by anyone who had the power to actually affect the answer. He looked at his hands for a moment. Then he looked at Nathan. "I want to choose," he said. "I want to make choices that are actually mine. About where I live, and what I do, and who I—" He stopped. "About everything. I do not want a bond that rewrites my identity. I do not want to be claimed. I want to be known. And I want to be able to say yes to something from a position of strength, rather than because the law left me no other option." Nathan nodded. Then we need to talk about what that looks like, he said, because that is not what bonding currently looks like in this dominion. A pause. But that does not mean it cannot. Eli looked at him. You are serious, he said. I am always serious, Nathan said. You have known me for several weeks. Something very small and unexpected moved through Eli's chest. Not quite laughter, but close to it. You cannot rebuild the bond law, Eli said. I run the Dominion, Nathan said. I can do whatever the evidence and the arguments support. He leaned forward slightly. And I have an archivist, who is apparently very good at building complete records. We could start there. Eli was quiet. He was looking at the small portrait on the corner of the desk, two people laughing at something outside the frame. This is not going to be simple, he said. No, Nathan agreed. Very few things worth doing are. Eli looked at the fire. Then he looked at Nathan. Where do we start? He said. Nathan picked up a pen. Tell me everything, he said. From the beginning. Eli started talking. He talked for a long time. And for the first time in 5 years, the things he was saying matched what was actually true. The palace had thousands of people in it on any given day. Thousands of people meant thousands of opportunities for information to travel faster than any official announcement could manage. It was not that palace staff were indiscreet. Most of them were professionals who understood the culture of discretion that royal service required. But information moved through a palace the way heat moved through stone, gradually, inevitably, and without anyone being able to identify the precise moment the wall went from cold to warm. Within 10 days of Eli's conversation with Nathan in the study, 3 things had happened. Nathan had requested Eli be formally reassigned from his standard cataloging role to a consultancy position on the Bond Law Review Committee, a committee that, as of the previous week, officially existed on paper for the first time in the Dominion's history. Colin had drafted the committee's mandate. Eli had reviewed and significantly expanded it. Nathan had stopped finding reasons to visit the archive, and had simply started inviting Eli to meetings at the palace. And Harold Fenn, who had survived 3 kings by paying attention to everything, had noticed. Harold went to Colin first. This was how Harold always operated. He gathered information before he moved, because in his experience, an argument made with incomplete information was a dangerous thing. He went to Colin on a Tuesday afternoon, under the pretext of reviewing the committee's mandate, and asked several questions that were not actually about the committee's mandate. Colin answered them with the careful precision of someone who was protecting the king's business while not technically lying. Yes, the senior catalogist from the archive had been brought into the review process. Yes, the review was directly authorized by the king. No, the scope had not been formally announced yet. Yes, the king was directly involved in drafting the new framework. Harold listened. He asked one more question. Is there a personal dimension to this review that the council should be aware of? Colin looked at him. The king will inform the council of relevant developments at the appropriate time. Harold thanked him and left. He spent the next 3 days writing the most thorough formal petition of his career. The council meeting was on a Thursday. It was not scheduled. Harold had called it under the emergency protocol, the clause that allowed the head of council to convene a full session on 12 hours' notice if a matter of significant public concern required immediate discussion. He had used it 3 times in 6 years, and each time it had been warranted. Nathan walked into the chamber, knowing exactly what the meeting was about. He had known it was coming. He had known it from the moment he stood in his study and listened to Eli talk, and understood that what was beginning could not be kept private indefinitely, not in a palace, not in a kingdom, not when the thing beginning involved the most publicly visible person in the Dominion. He sat down at the head of the table. Harold stood. Your Highness, Harold said, and the formal title was a signal in itself. Harold used it when he was performing authority, not when he was actually exercising it. The council has received information of a concerning nature regarding the King's Bond Law Review Initiative. Specifically, concerns have been raised regarding the designation status of the individual appointed as primary consultant to the review committee. It has come to the council's attention that the individual in question may be registered as a beta while presenting biological markers inconsistent with that designation. If accurate, this would constitute a significant breach of Dominion law and would represent a serious liability to the review process and to the throne itself. The chamber was very quiet. Nathan let the quiet sit for a moment. "Harold," he said, "how did this come to the council's attention?" Harold did not blink. "Through appropriate channels." "What specific channels?" A brief pause. "Medical administrative cross-referencing during the formal appointment process for committee members." Nathan nodded slowly. "So, in the process of vetting a staff member for a formal advisory role, someone accessed private medical records." Harold opened his mouth. "Which," Nathan continued, "raises a rather more interesting legal question than the one you have raised. Because the access of private medical documentation, without a warrant or a direct judicial order, is itself a violation of Dominion privacy law." He looked around the table. "I assume you would all like to discuss that as well." Several members of the council looked at their papers. Harold did not look at his papers. "The designation concealment is a matter I am already aware of and am handling through the appropriate review process," Nathan said. "The Law Review Committee exists specifically to examine the adequacy of current designation law. The fact that the committee's primary consultant has direct lived experience of the law's failures is not a liability. It is the most relevant qualification that consultant could have." "Your Highness." Harold's voice went flat. "The individual in question is an Omega who has been concealing their designation for 5 years. The law as it currently stands requires—" "The law as it currently stands is what we are reviewing," Nathan said. "That is the point of the committee. The council has the right to—" "The council advises the king," Nathan said. "That is the council's role. Advice, not decision, not veto. Advice." He stood up. "I will advise you of committee developments at the appropriate time. If the council has concerns about the medical records access issue, I suggest someone prepare a full account of how that information was obtained and who authorized the access." He looked at Harold. "I will need that report by Monday." He left the chamber. In the corridor, Colin appeared at his side. "That went approximately as expected," Colin said. "Yes." "Harold will petition the Eastern Magistrate for a designation compliance review." "I know. It will be a formal legal challenge to Eli's appointment." "I know. What do we do?" Nathan walked for a moment without answering. The corridor lanterns burned in their amber line. The portrait of his father watched from the far wall. "We build the argument better than they build theirs," he said. "We have more history, more documentation, and a better case. And we have someone who is very good at making incomplete records complete." Colin wrote something in his journal. "And Eli?" he said. Nathan was quiet for a moment. "Make sure he knows what is coming." The news reached Eli through Clara. Clara had contacts everywhere. It was one of the things that made her simultaneously useful and exhausting, and she appeared at his apartment door that same evening with the kind of expression that meant she was about to tell him something important and was not sure how he was going to receive it. She told him. Eli sat very still for a moment on the other side of the small kitchen table. "The council knows," he said. "Harold Fenn knows, which means the council knows," Clara explained. "The medical records, the appointment vetting process, the information trail." Eli listened to all of it with the controlled attention of someone who was absorbing a significant amount of information and filing it in the correct order. "Okay," he said. Clara looked at him. "Eli, they know what you are. They could pursue a formal compliance case." "I know. You could be reassigned. Your position could be—" "Clara." He looked at her steadily. "I know. I have known this was a possibility since the first time I submitted a suppressant prescription. I have always known that hiding carries a risk, and I chose to carry it because the alternative was worse." He was quiet for a moment. "The difference now is that I am not hiding anymore." She looked at him. "The king knows," he said. "The council is going to know. And eventually the whole Dominion is going to know. Probably. Because things like this do not stay contained in a palace." He looked at his hands. "The question is, what kind of story gets told about it? And that is what Nathan and I are working on." Clara was quiet. Then she said, very softly, "You called him Nathan." Eli looked at her. He had not noticed. He had not noticed. Clara did not say anything else about it. She got up, made tea, and sat back down, and they talked for 2 hours about what was coming and how to face it. It was, Eli thought, the most genuine conversation he had ever had in his kitchen. In the weeks that followed, the palace split in the way that institutions split when something changes that the institution had not planned for. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the slow, sure way of something whose center of gravity has shifted. You could see it in the posture of the staff members Eli passed in the corridors. Some of them nodded to him the same way they always had. Some of them did not look at him. A few went out of their way to be warmer than usual, which was its own kind of statement. Basil Ford called him into his office on a Wednesday morning. "I want you to know," Basil said, in his direct and slightly emotional way, "that this archive is not going to change how it operates based on who you are. You have been the best catalogist I have worked with in 30 years. Your work speaks for itself, and that is the position of this building." Eli looked at him. "Thank you, Basil," he said. He meant it. Outside the archive, the formal petition from Harold's office was working its way through the Eastern Magistrate's office. There were press inquiries. There were editorial pieces. There were opinions, which the Dominion had never been short of, about what the relationship between the Alpha King and an Omega archivist meant for the future of the designation system, and the bond tradition, and the natural order that 300 years of pack governance had been built on. The natural order. Nathan read one of the editorials at his desk one evening and sat with it for a long time. He picked up his pen. He did not write a response to the editorial. He wrote the first paragraph of the new law. The pressure had a particular quality in the second month. It was not the formal challenges that were hardest. Those were things you could address with documentation and argument, which were Eli's native territory, and Nathan's as well. The Eastern Magistrate's petition was responded to with a 60-page historical analysis of designation law that Eli had compiled in 8 days, and that Nathan's legal team had described, with some surprise, as the most thorough legal argument they had reviewed in a decade. The press editorials had generated counter-editorials. The council's objections had been met, formally and on the record, with the kind of steady authority that 8 years of governance had made second nature to Nathan. What was harder was the accumulation of smaller things. The way that certain members of the palace staff visibly changed their behavior around Eli, not hostile, but careful, the kind of careful that meant they were watching for guidance from above before deciding how to act. The 2 committee members who had submitted quiet letters of withdrawal from the review committee. The correspondence that began arriving at the archive, addressed to Eli by name, from people outside the palace, some supportive, most not. All of them carrying the particular weight of strangers feeling entitled to tell him what his life meant. And the specific, growing, unavoidable knowledge that every time Nathan chose to stand publicly beside what they were building, it cost him something. Not in the immediate sense. Nathan was fully capable of weathering the council opposition, and the formal legal challenges were not going to succeed once the argument was properly presented. But in the longer sense, in the sense of political capital and public perception, and the slow erosion of the particular kind of respect that kings built through conventional behavior. Eli watched it happen. He watched it with the same precision he brought to everything, and the picture he built was clear. He made the decision on a Saturday. He made it alone, which was perhaps the most honest thing about it, not after a conversation, not after being convinced by anyone's argument, but after sitting by his kitchen window for an hour, and looking at the city below, and being as honest with himself as he had ever been. The review committee could continue without him. The law argument they had built was documented, sourced, and thorough enough to stand on its own. The historical analysis he had compiled was already with Nathan's legal team. What he had contributed could be continued by others, not as well, but adequately. He was not the only person who could do this work. He was, however, the specific person whose existence was being used as a weapon against the man who was trying to do something genuinely important. He wrote a note. He wrote it carefully, in the same small handwriting he used for everything, and he kept it short, because short was honest. He said that he was removing himself from the committee and from the palace staff. He said that the work they had started was real and necessary and should continue. He said that the argument they had built together was the best work he had ever done, and he was proud of it. He said he refused to be the reason that argument failed. He put the note in an envelope. He addressed it to Nathan's study. He left it with the palace courier late on a Sunday evening, when the building was quiet. He went home to his apartment in the lower district. He packed a bag, not the careful, systematic packing of a planned move, but the quick, functional packing of someone who needed to not be findable for a little while. A few days' worth of clothes, his journal, his medication, the borrowed history book he was halfway through and could not bring himself to leave. He closed the bag. He sat on the edge of his bed for a moment. He thought about the private study, the fire, the small portrait of two people laughing. He thought about what Nathan had said. We could start there. He closed his eyes briefly. Then he stood up, picked up the bag, and went to the apartment he had lived in before the archive, the one he had kept quietly paying rent on for 2 years as a contingency, because Eli Haynes had always believed in contingencies. He let himself in. He sat down on the simple bed in the simple room. The city outside was making its familiar nighttime sounds. He was okay. He had made the right decision. He believed this absolutely, and it helped not at all. Nathan found the note on Monday morning. He had been in a meeting with the legal team when the courier came, and Colin had taken the envelope and brought it to him during the break, and Nathan had recognized the handwriting on the envelope immediately, and had said something sufficiently neutral that the rest of the room did not register the shift in his attention, and had waited until the meeting ended to open it. He read it once. He stood up from the table. "Cancel everything," he said. Colin looked at him. "Nathan, today. Cancel everything today." He was already moving. "I need to know where Eli's apartment is, the one in the lower district. I have the address from the staff records. Then come with me." They were in the carriage within 6 minutes. Nathan said nothing on the ride. He was looking out the window at the city in the way he looked at problems, assessing, following the logic, building the picture. He was not in the specific emotional state that would have made the situation harder to address. He was doing what he always did when something important was not going the way it should, moving. The lower district was busy in the mid-morning way of a working neighborhood. Market vendors, foot traffic, the sounds of a bakery and a repair shop and a tea house operating alongside each other. The carriage stopped at the building above the tea shop. Nathan got out. He went upstairs. He knocked. No answer. He asked the neighbor, a red-haired woman who answered her door with an expression of someone who had expected exactly this to happen, if she knew where Eli had gone. Clara Potts looked at him with the particular assessment of someone who had been Eli Haynes's friend for 2 years and was now deciding something important about the king of the Northern Pack Dominion. She told him the address. The other apartment was in the adjacent street, 1 floor up in a building that was slightly smaller than the tea shop one, quiet, the kind of place that asked nothing of the people who lived there. Nathan went up the stairs alone. He knocked. A long pause. The door opened. Eli was wearing ordinary clothes, not his work jacket, not his archive clothes. Just a plain shirt and trousers. His bag was on the floor near the bed, half unpacked or half packed, impossible to tell. He looked at Nathan with an expression that was completely controlled and did not hide, to Nathan's eyes, a single thing. "You found me," Eli said. "Yes. I left an address in the staff records." "I know." Clara also helped. Eli's expression shifted very slightly. "Of course she did." Nathan looked at him. He had thought about what to say on the carriage ride. He had sorted through arguments and responses, and every possible version of what Eli's note might mean about what Eli needed. He had prepared for several different conversations. He said none of what he had prepared. He said, "Did you leave because you wanted to, or because you thought I deserved better?" Eli looked at him. The question sat between them in the narrow room. Outside, the city was doing its ordinary mid-morning things. Somewhere below, the tea house on the adjacent street was producing the faint smell of something warm. A cart went by on the cobblestones. Eli stood in his doorway and said nothing for a long moment. Nathan waited. He was very good at waiting. He had learned it early and practiced it for years, and it was one of the most useful things he had ever taught himself. He waited now, with the full attention of a person who intended to hear whatever came next with complete care. Eli said, "I watched what it cost you. I know. The council, the petitions, the editorials. Every time they needed someone to target, I was there. My existence was the argument they were using against everything you were trying to." Eli stopped. "Answer the question," Nathan said. "Not the reason, the question." Another silence. Eli's jaw tightened very slightly. Then it released. "I left because I thought you deserved better," he said. Then what? Nathan said. Then a person who makes your governance harder. Nathan looked at him for a moment. Then he said, every person who has ever changed anything worth changing has made governance harder. That is not a disqualification, that is the description. Eli said nothing. I am not asking you to make things easy, Nathan said. I am asking you to come back, not for the committee, not for the archive. Because what we have started talking about is the most important conversation I have had in 8 years of ruling a kingdom, and I am not willing to have it end because you decided to protect me from something I have already decided to take on. Eli leaned against the doorframe. He was looking at the floor for a moment. Then he looked at Nathan. You should have someone who does not come with this much complication, he said. It was the last version of the argument, the quietest one. Probably, Nathan said, but you are the person I want to figure it out with. A pause. If that is what you want to. The city was quiet. The tea house smell drifted upward. Eli closed his eyes for 1 second. Then he opened them. Let me pack properly, he said. Nathan exhaled. I will wait, he said. They came back on a Tuesday. There was nothing staged about it, no announcement, no formal entrance through the palace gates with observers lining the approach. Eli simply came back, to the archive in the morning, to the committee meeting in the afternoon, to the work that needed doing. Nathan was already at his desk when the morning began, as he always was, doing the necessary things with the same efficient attention that had characterized 8 years of governance. What was different was that the particular pretense was gone. Not the composure, not the professionalism, those were genuine qualities, not performances, and they remained. What was gone was the careful layering of alternative explanations, the administrative reviews, the retrieval failures, the process improvements that had all served as reasons to be in the same place, the transparent reasons that no one had believed anyway. They were simply, publicly, working together. That was what people saw first. What they made of it was, as always, a broad range of things. The Eastern Magistrate's petition was resolved in the 3rd week. Nathan's legal team, working from the 60-page analysis that Eli had built, and the 300-year historical record that supported it, made the argument that the designation concealment statute, as currently written, did not account for documented cases of legitimate harm prevention. The historical record showed 11 documented cases in Dominion history, where Omega concealment had been the direct result of systemic legal failure, rather than individual deception. Eli's case fit the pattern precisely. The magistrate's office reviewed the argument for 6 days. On the 7th day, they requested an additional 20-page addendum addressing the historical precedent for legal revision in designation cases. Eli wrote the addendum in 4 days. On the 11th day, the petition was dismissed. Harold Fenn, when informed, sat with the news for a long time. Nathan visited him that afternoon, not to gloat, not to perform victory, but because Harold had served the Dominion well for 30 years, and that deserved acknowledgement, even in the moments when they disagreed. The law is changing, Nathan said. He sat across from Harold in the older man's office. Not the council chamber, just the office. A smaller, quieter space. I want to do it right. I want the historical argument to be airtight. I want the legal language to be precise. And I want the council involved in that process, Harold, because the council's function is exactly that, to advise, to improve. A pause. You are very good at your job. I need that right now. Harold was quiet for a long time. Then he said, the argument is thorough. Yes. The historical precedent is real. It has always been real. We just did not look at it. Another pause. The bond framework would need a complete rewrite. I know. That is why I need the best people on it. Harold looked at him. He picked up his pen. Send me the committee schedule, he said. The bond law review took 4 months. It was not a simple process. Changing a law that had been foundational to the Dominion's social structure for 300 years was not a thing that could be done quickly or without resistance. There were revisions, debates, public consultations. There were members of the council who pushed back at every stage. There were arguments about tradition and social fabric and the natural order that Nathan listened to carefully and responded to with the same patience and precision he brought to everything. Eli attended every meeting. He brought the documents, always the right documents, always with the correct cross-references. always annotated clearly enough that anyone in the room could follow the reasoning. He built the case from the ground up, in the same way he had rebuilt the pre-settlement index. Methodically, completely, without gaps. The new framework that emerged was not the complete revolution that some had hoped for, or the contained adjustment that others had pushed toward. It was something more specific. It was a legal recognition that designation status was a biological fact that did not, by itself, constitute a legal identity. That Omegas were full legal persons independent of any bond. That bonding was a legal partnership, not a legal restructuring. That the choice to bond, or not to bond, belonged to the person making it. It was small. By the standards of 300 years, it was an enormous amount of ground. Nathan signed it into law on a Thursday, in the council chamber, with the full council present. Not all of them were satisfied, not all of them would be, and he knew it. Change moved through institutions the way change always moved, unevenly, with friction, leaving some sections warm before others. But it was signed. It was law. The bond they chose was a different kind of conversation. Not a formal declaration through the old channels, which would have required the old language and the old framework, and had, until last month, been the only option available to them. Under the new law, a bond was a documented partnership, witnessed, chosen, and recorded. That was all it needed to be. They chose a witness, Colin Drake, who had been watching this develop for months, with the particular expression of someone who was not surprised, but was deeply moved, and was doing his best to look professionally neutral about it. They chose a room. Not the council chamber, not the formal reception hall, the study, Nathan's study, with the fire burning and the city outside the window, and the small portrait of two people laughing on the corner of the desk. The documentation was simple. The witness signed. Nathan signed. Eli signed. Colin stood there for a moment afterward and then, professionally, said that the paperwork would be filed in the morning. Then he closed the door behind him on the way out. The room was very quiet. Nathan looked at Eli. Eli looked at Nathan. "That was surprisingly undramatic," Eli said. "Did you want dramatic?" "No," Eli said. "I wanted exactly this." Nathan looked at the portrait on the corner of the desk. His parents, young, laughing at something outside the frame. Chosen, he thought, before any of it mattered. Just two people who saw each other and decided. He looked at Eli. Eli was looking at the portrait too. "Your parents?" Eli said. "Before they were king and queen," Nathan said, "before anything." Eli nodded slowly. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think that is what makes it real. The choosing before it is required." Nathan thought about that. "Yes," he said. "I think so too." Eli went back to the archives. This was perhaps the most significant thing, in the quiet, practical sense that mattered most to him. He could have taken a different position. The committee had opened other options, and Nathan would have supported any of them. But the archive was the archive. It was the place where he had built something real, quietly and entirely on his own, and he was not willing to let the noise of the past several months take that from him. He went back. Basil Ford was quietly delighted. The rolling ladders still moved on their brass rails. The ventilation system still maintained the correct humidity for document preservation. The smell was still paper and old binding glue, and the particular cool dryness of a building that took its function seriously. Eli sat at his desk. He opened the acquisition log. He wrote the date. He went to work. He did not wear the jacket that was one size too large anymore. He had stopped wearing it in the 6th month of the committee process, when it had begun to feel less like protection and more like a habit that no longer served its original purpose. He wore something that fit correctly. He moved through the archive without the particular containment that had characterized his first 3 years. He was still quiet. He was still precise. He was still the person who arrived before anyone else, and stayed until the work was done. He was just no longer hiding while he did it. The new designation registration system that came into effect 6 months after the law change was the practical result of what the committee had built. Omegas could now register at their correct designation, without being automatically assigned legal guardian status. The bond record was now a voluntary partnership document, rather than a legal identity restructuring. The suppressant prescription system was reformed to operate through standard medical channels, without the particular web of quiet doctors and strategic privacy that people like Eli had relied on for years. It was not everything. The committee had been honest about that from the beginning. 300 years of social framework did not change in 4 months, and a law changing did not automatically mean the attitudes that the law had created changed alongside it. There was still work to do. There would always be work to do. Nathan knew this and had said so, publicly and on the record, in the formal announcement of the new framework. But the record was no longer incomplete. That was the thing that mattered to Eli, specifically and precisely. The record of what designation meant in the Northern Pact Dominion was no longer a document with deliberate gaps. The gaps had been closed. The history had been made accurate. The archive, the great wide archive of the Dominion's actual story, not the version it had told itself for 300 years, had been made more complete. An incomplete record was just an organized version of forgetting. They were no longer forgetting. It was a Thursday afternoon when Nathan came to the archive, not for an inspection, not for a review, not with Colin at his side, and a list of administrative questions, and a schedule that needed restructuring to accommodate the visit. He came with a book. He came in through the staff entrance. Eli had given him the code, which had caused Basil Ford's eyebrows to rise to an unprecedented height for approximately 3 seconds before he composed himself, and he went to the back section and sat down in the chair across from the work desk. Eli looked at him. "I have 3 hours before the Border Commission review," Nathan said. He opened the book. "I will be quiet." Eli looked at him for a moment. Then he looked back at the acquisition log. "The light is better on the right side of the room," he said. Nathan moved the chair to the right. He sat. He read. Eli worked. The ventilation system did its quiet work. The afternoon light came through the narrow windows in its long, slanting lines and moved slowly across the floor. Somewhere in the building, the rolling ladder moved on its brass rail. A researcher in the front section turned a page. The city outside was doing its ordinary things. Nathan read 3 chapters without looking up. Eli cataloged the afternoon's acquisitions without looking up. At some point, one of them, neither of them could have said exactly when, reached across the desk for a cross-reference document, and the other passed it over without either of them breaking their concentration, and the transfer was so natural and so automatic that it did not interrupt either the reading or the cataloging by even a breath. It was not a remarkable moment. It was, by any visible measure, 2 people sitting in a quiet room doing their work. But Nathan Cross, who had stood at too many midnight windows looking at a city that needed him and had no one to share it with, who had read a line in someone else's journal and felt something in himself finally settle into place. Nathan Cross sat in the back section of the Royal Records Hall on a Thursday afternoon, with a book open in his lap and the sound of small, precise handwriting moving across paper nearby, and felt the silence in his chest go completely quiet for the first time in 8 years. Not empty quiet, not the quiet of absence, the quiet of something full, finally, in the right place. Eli's pen moved across the page. The afternoon light moved across the floor. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing that needed saying. The record was complete. The first ordinary morning was strange, in the specific way that ordinary things become strange when you have spent a long time expecting something else. Eli arrived at the archive at 7, as he always had. He unlocked the staff entrance, turned on the work lights, hung his bag and jacket, and went to his desk. The acquisition log was exactly where he had left it the evening before. The third-floor vault still needed the inter-period records reorganized. The humidity report from the West Annex still needed a response before the end of the week. Nothing had changed. Everything had changed. He sat for a moment before opening the log, looking at the room. The same mahogany shelves, the same long slanting lines of morning light, beginning to find their way through the narrow windows. The same rolling ladder, motionless on its brass rail in the far corner. The back section of the Royal Records Hall looked precisely as it had looked on every morning for 3 years. But Eli Haynes was not the same person who had walked into it 3 years ago. He opened the log. He wrote the date. He went to work. It was Colin who told him, 2 weeks after the bond was signed and the law was officially in effect, that 43 people had contacted the formal designation registry to request voluntary re-registration. 43 Omegas across the Dominion who had either been hiding, or registered incorrectly, or living under suppression arrangements that were about to become medically supported rather than medically circumvented. 43 cases, in 2 weeks, of people who had been waiting for a gap in the wall to step through. Eli sat with that number for a moment. How many were hiding under beta registration? He asked. 31, Colin said. The other 12 are registered correctly, but want to update their legal status. Remove the guardian assignment. 31 people who had been doing what he had done, living inside the specific, exhausting discipline of being something the world did not know you were. The re-registration process, Eli said. Is it straightforward? It should be. The new framework is clear. But the administrative system is old, and the language in some of the forms still reflects the old law. There are going to be gaps. Colin looked at him. Nathan was thinking you might be well placed to review the process. Eli nodded. He already had 3 observations about the administrative gaps. He wrote them down in the margins of the registration framework document Colin had given him, and handed it back. Colin looked at the notes. You did that in 30 seconds. I have been thinking about the gaps for a while, Eli said. The first person he met who had re-registered under the new law was not one of the 43. She came to the archive on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the law took effect. A young woman named Margaret Ellis, 23 years old, who had been registered as an Omega since she was 18, and who had spent the intervening 5 years with a legal guardian assigned to her file, a man she had never met, whose signature was required on every occupational application she submitted. She had applied for a position at the Royal Records Hall. She had been referred directly to Eli. She sat across the desk from him in the back section, and she had the posture of someone who had spent 5 years bracing for disappointment and had not yet decided whether it was safe to stop bracing. The senior catalogist position, she said. I studied archive management at the Eastern University. I have 3 years of practical experience at the Civic Records Office. My references are... I have read your references, Eli said. They are excellent. She paused. The previous application I submitted was rejected because my guardian's signature was missing from the occupational consent form. The occupational consent form no longer exists, Eli said. It was removed from the application process in the first revision, under the new framework. You apply independently. Your qualifications are assessed on their own terms. Margaret Ellis looked at him. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, very quietly, Is that actually true? Yes, Eli said. Would you like me to show you the updated application documentation? She said yes. He showed her. She went through it carefully. The way someone goes through something they have been told before, but have learned not to believe, until they have seen it with their own eyes. When she finished, she set the papers down on the desk, and looked at the shelving system behind Eli's head for a moment, as if she was seeing something that was not the shelving system. I applied to 6 positions, she said, over 2 years, all rejected. Not because of my qualifications. I know, Eli said. She looked at him. You were hiding. Yes. And now you are not. No. She was quiet for another moment. Then she picked up the application form. Where do I sign? She said. Eli pointed to the correct line. She signed. He processed the application in front of her, so she could see it happen. She got the position. That evening, Eli sat at his desk in the back section for a while after the building had emptied, with his hands flat on the work surface, and the lamplight low, and the archive quiet around him, in its familiar, permanent way. He was not thinking about anything in particular. He was just sitting with the particular feeling of a thing that had seemed impossible for a very long time beginning, slowly and imperfectly, and in the specific case of one person at a time, to become possible. He went home. He told Clara about Margaret Ellis over dinner at her apartment that evening. Clara listened to the whole account. Then she said, You changed her entire professional future today. The law changed it, Eli said. I just processed the paperwork. Eli. He looked at her. You are allowed to know that you did something that mattered, she said. He looked at his plate for a moment. I know, he said. He meant it differently than he usually meant things. Not as a deflection, but as a genuine acknowledgement. He was still learning how to receive things like that. After 5 years of keeping everything interior, of building walls between himself and any form of recognition, the practice of simply accepting that something he had done had value was new territory. He was learning. He went home that night and wrote in his journal, the worn leather one, no longer a secret, no longer the repository of a double life, but simply a record of a person thinking through their days. He wrote about Margaret Ellis. He wrote about the 43 registrations. He wrote about what it meant to him that the wall he had lived behind for 5 years was being dismantled by other people now, not just by him. He left the journal on the bedside table, visible, where he had not kept it in years. He went to sleep. Nathan sent a note the following morning. Not formal correspondence. A brief handwritten line on a scrap of paper, the kind of communication that belonged to people who had stopped performing for each other. It said, "Colin told me about the Ellis appointment. That is the law working the way we intended." Eli read it at his desk. He put it in the drawer where he kept things that were worth keeping. Then he went back to the acquisition log. There were still documents to be cataloged, there always were. The record was always incomplete until someone decided it should not be. That was the work. That had always been the work. He picked up his pen. He wrote the next entry. The day moved forward. The letter from the Southern Pac Territories arrived on a Wednesday morning and was, by any reasonable assessment, politely written. This was the first sign that it was serious. Philip Grange was 68 years old and had led the Southern Pac Territories for 22 years, with a consistency of principle that Nathan had always respected, even when the principle in question was inconvenient. He was not a man who made public challenges for political effect. When Philip Grange wrote a letter, he was telling you something he had already decided. The letter said that the Southern Pac Territories formally disputed the bond law revision as inconsistent with the Inter-Pac Governance Compact signed 312 years ago, which required that any change to shared governance standards, including designation law, which had always been classified as a shared standard, be approved by the full territorial council, not by a single dominion. Nathan read the letter twice. He handed it to Colin. Colin read it once. He is not wrong about the compact, he said. The bond law was classified as shared governance 300 years ago. I know. Which means technically. Technically, yes. Nathan was quiet for a moment. When was the compact last reviewed? Colin checked his journal. The last formal review was 47 years ago. And the bond law was classified as shared governance how? By inclusion. When the compact was written, all existing laws were classified by category and included in the shared standards list. The bond law was included at that time. By the people who wrote it. Yes. And who were the people who wrote it? Colin was quiet. Then he said, I do not know. The original compact was written at the founding conference of the Inter-Pac Territories. The records from that period are in the archive, Nathan said. He looked at Eli, who was sitting on the other side of the desk reviewing the committee's final implementation notes, and had been listening to this entire exchange, with the expression of someone who already had several thoughts about it, and was waiting to be asked. The founding conference records, Eli said. 3rd floor, pre-settlement vault, eastern section. I have reviewed approximately 2/3 of that collection, as part of the index rebuild. He paused. I do not recall seeing any designation law discussion in the compact drafting records. But I have not reviewed all of them. Could you finish the review? Nathan said. I could have a preliminary answer by the end of the week. Thursday, Nathan said. Friday morning, Eli said. Nathan accepted that. Colin wrote a formal response to Philip Grange acknowledging receipt of the letter and advising that the matter was under review. The review began at 7 the following morning. Eli went through the pre-settlement vault with the systematic attention that he had applied to every section of the archive over 3 years, pulling the founding conference records in chronological order and working through them with the methodical care that the material deserved. He was looking for 2 things: any record of designation law being discussed at the founding conference, and any record of how the classification of shared governance standards had been determined. He found the first, not the second. On Thursday afternoon, he found a set of correspondence records from the founding conference that he had not previously reviewed. 7 letters written over the course of 2 weeks by the 3 territorial leaders who had drafted the original compact, arguing about the scope of shared governance. He read them. He read them a second time. He sat with what they contained for a long moment. Then he went to find Nathan. He was in his study, in his usual late afternoon configuration, jacket off, document in hand, the particular focused energy of a man who ran on sustained attention, rather than dramatic peaks. He looked up when Eli came in. He saw Eli's expression. "What did you find?" he said. Eli set the correspondence records on the desk. "Sit down," he said. "This is going to take a while." Nathan sat down. They read together. The founding conference letters described, in the direct and occasionally heated language of three powerful people negotiating under pressure, a fight about exactly one question: which laws belonged to the shared compact, and which belonged to individual territories. Designation law had not been discussed in terms of tradition or natural order, or any of the 300-year framework that had been built around it. It had been discussed in one paragraph, in a letter from the second founder to the third, as a political concession. The Southern Territories wanted the bond law included as a shared standard because their own Omega population was significant, and the Southern leaders believed shared governance would prevent other territories from creating more liberal frameworks that would draw their Omega residents away. The third founder had objected. The third founder's objection had been overridden in the final compact. In a footnote, 300 years of tradition, generations of people whose lives had been shaped by the assumption that this was how things had always been, and always must be. A footnote, written under political pressure, by a man who did not believe it, and said so in a letter that had been sitting in the east section of the pre-settlement vault, unread, for 312 years. Nathan sat with the letters for a long time. Then he said, "Philip Grange does not know about this." "No," Eli said, "no one did. Until now. If he knew, his formal challenge would look very different. He is a man who cares about evidence. He has always governed from evidence." Eli looked at the letters. He is citing the compact in good faith. He believes the compact reflects a genuine historical consensus. Nathan looked at him. Does he know the compact was not a consensus? The founding letters were never made public. They are classified as administrative records, not historical policy records, which is why they have not been reviewed as part of the governance archive. He paused. They should have been. That was a misclassification. 300-year-old misclassification. They happen, Eli said. Nathan almost smiled. He did not quite manage it, but the shape of it was there. "We need to go to the Southern Territories," he said. "Yes. And we need to bring the letters. They will need to be formally authenticated and transferred into the governance record first. That takes approximately a week with the current process, or 3 days, if the senior catalogist personally oversees the authentication. How long if the senior catalogist personally oversees it?" 3 days, Eli said, "starting tomorrow." Nathan picked up his pen. "I will arrange the travel," he said. Eli went back to the archive. He worked through the following 3 days, with the focused intensity of someone who had a clear timeline and a clear task, and was not going to let either one slip. The founding letters were authenticated, cross-referenced with the Administrative Record Index, formally classified as governance documents, and assigned their correct position in the archive's organizational system for the first time in 300 years. He packed them carefully for transport. He told Clara the night before the journey, over the phone, rather than in person, because the hour was late, and he had 3 more pages of authentication notes to complete before morning. "The Southern Territories," Clara said. "That is a week's travel." 4 days by official carriage, Eli said. "The route has improved since the road expansion last year. Nathan is going with you." "Yes. And you are going as the official representative of the archive. As the senior catalogist." "Yes." A pause. "Eli, I know," he said. He did know. 2 years ago, the idea of traveling with the king as his official colleague, carrying documents that could reshape interpact governance, would have been so far outside the boundaries of his possible life that he would not even have known how to imagine it. "Be careful," Clara said. "I am always careful," he said. "Be less careful than you usually are," she said. "About the parts that do not need it anymore." He was quiet for a moment. "I am working on that," he said. He said good night. He finished the authentication notes. He packed his bag, properly, with enough clothing for a week, and his journal, which he packed openly in the outer pocket. In the morning, they went south. The Southern Territories were warmer than the capital, in the way of places that had more sun and less stone. The landscape changed gradually over 4 days of travel, from the dense packed buildings of the Northern Pack Dominion, to wider roads lined with lower architecture, and fields that were still green, even in middle autumn. because the southern climate did not arrive at cold the same way the north did. Eli watched it from the carriage window with the attention of someone encountering a new place for the first time. Nathan read reports on the carriage. He was, Eli had come to understand, a person who was incapable of being physically present somewhere without also being productively engaged. "Tell me about Philip Grange," Eli said, on the second morning of travel. Nathan set down the report he was reviewing. "What specifically? What kind of person is he? Not politically, as a person." Nathan considered this. "Methodical. He makes decisions slowly and keeps them permanently. He has governed the Southern Territories for 22 years without a significant scandal, because he does not do things he cannot defend in public, which is a rarer quality than it sounds." He paused. "He is also deeply loyal to what he believes the Interpack Compact represents, not the specific text of it, the principle, the idea that the territories govern together, that no single power should be able to make unilateral changes to shared frameworks. Which is why he challenged the bond law revision. Yes, he was not challenging us specifically. He was defending a principle he has held for 22 years. Eli thought about that. He is going to find the founding letters difficult to receive. I know. It will mean that the principle he has been defending was built on something that was not what he believed it to be. Yes. That is not a comfortable thing to discover. Nathan looked at him. There was something in his expression that was quiet and specific, the look of a person who understood exactly what it felt like to discover that the framework you had trusted had a false foundation somewhere inside it. No, Nathan said, it is not. Eli turned back to the window. They arrived in the Southern Territories capital on the fourth day, and Philip Grange met them in the formal receiving hall with the kind of greeting that was warm without being effusive, the greeting of a man who respected his guests and did not need to perform that respect. He was tall, silver-haired, and looked at Eli with the direct attention of someone who had made up his mind to treat the situation without prejudice, and was doing so deliberately rather than naturally. Eli appreciated the deliberateness. It was more honest than the effortless version would have been. "Mr. Haynes," Philip said, "I have read the historical analysis your committee produced. It was thorough work." "Thank you," Eli said. "I disagreed with several of its conclusions." "I know. We were hoping to discuss those disagreements." Philip nodded. "Tomorrow morning, if that suits, I will have my own legal team present." "Of course," Nathan said. "We have some additional material to share before the formal meeting, if you have time this evening." Philip looked at him. The experienced eye of a man who had spent 22 years in formal governance recognized that this request was more significant than its tone suggested. "After dinner," he said. "An hour." The dinner was good. After dinner, they moved to Philip's private study. Nathan produced the authenticated founding letters from the document case and placed them on Philip's desk. He said, "These were classified incorrectly in the archive for 300 years. They were authenticated and reclassified as governance documents last week. They are the founding conference letters, the private correspondence between the three original compact drafters." Philip looked at the documents. He did not reach for them immediately. He looked at Nathan first. "What is in them?" he said. Nathan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Evidence that the designation law's inclusion in the compact was a political concession rather than a consensus decision, and that the third founder, who represented the Northern and Eastern Territories, explicitly objected to the inclusion and was overruled." Philip sat very still. "The third founder," he said. "Yes. Marcus Grange," Philip said. It was a moment that neither Nathan nor Eli had anticipated, because neither of them had thought to look up the names of the founding compact signatories. Marcus Grange was the third founder. The man who had objected to the designation law's inclusion in the compact 312 years ago was Philip Grange's direct ancestor. The room was very quiet. Philip reached forward and picked up the first letter. He read it. He read all 7. He set them down carefully. He sat with his hands flat on the desk for a long moment, and his expression had the particular quality of a person rearranging something fundamental, not fighting it, not rejecting it, just making room for a truth that had not been there before. "My family," he said slowly, "has spent 300 years defending a compact that included a provision my ancestor tried to prevent. Yes, Nathan said. And the objection is here, in his own writing. Yes. Philip looked at the letters again. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, I will need to speak with my legal team tonight. The meeting tomorrow morning is going to be a different conversation than the one I had planned. Nathan nodded. Philip, he said, I did not bring these to embarrass you or to win an argument. I brought them because you are a man who governs from evidence, and this is evidence that belongs to the governance record. You deserve to see it. Philip looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at Eli. How long had they been misfiled? He said. 312 years, Eli said. A long pause. That, Philip Grange said, with the dry precision of a man who had spent 22 years dealing with administrative failures, is an extremely long time for a misclassification. It is, Eli agreed. Something shifted slightly in Philip's expression, not quite a smile, but the space where one might eventually form. Tomorrow morning, he said, we will build something better. The morning meeting lasted 4 hours and produced a framework agreement signed by both the Northern Pac Dominion and the Southern Pac Territories, a mutual recognition of the bond law revision as consistent with the original intent of the compact, as evidenced by the founding letters. Philip Grange signed it with the particular gravity of a man who understood that he was correcting something his family had gotten wrong for 300 years. He said nothing dramatic about it. He just signed. Then he poured them both a glass of Southern wine and said, The Eastern Territories are going to be more difficult. I know, Nathan said. They always are, Philip said. They all three agreed on that. The carriage back from the Southern Territories took 4 days, during which Nathan and Eli drafted 3 documents simultaneously, a formal summary of the founding letters for the council, a proposed revision to the compact reclassification, and what Nathan referred to as the argument, and what Eli privately thought of as the case they should have been able to make 300 years ago, if anyone had been paying attention to the complete record. Eli wrote in his steady small handwriting, and Nathan read aloud and edited, and they disagreed twice, once about the framing of the third founder's objection, and once about the order of evidence presentation, and resolved both disagreements in the way they had come to resolve disagreements, which was that each of them made their argument fully, and then the one who had the stronger case prevailed, which was sometimes Nathan and sometimes Eli, and had never once been the result of anyone capitulating out of deference. That, Eli thought, was also something he had not expected. He had spent 5 years building a life in which he deferred to everyone, because deference was invisible. He had thought, somewhere in the back of his mind where unexamined beliefs lived, that the habit might be difficult to break. It had not been. He wrote that in his journal one evening, in the carriage, while Nathan was reading. He wrote, I have never been in a room with someone who argued back without needing to win. He looked at the line. He added, I have also never been someone who argued back without needing to disappear afterward. He closed the journal. They arrived back in the capital on a Tuesday, and on Wednesday morning Nathan called a full council session. Harold Fenn arrived with the particular expression of a man who had been thinking very carefully about something for 2 days and had arrived at a position he was not entirely comfortable with. He sat at his usual place at the table. He organized his papers. He waited. Nathan placed the founding letter summary on the table in front of each council member. Before we discuss the Southern Agreement, Nathan said, I want to review what the investigation of the compact records produced. Some of this information will be new to the council. I am asking you to read the summary carefully before we speak. The room was quiet while 12 people read. Harold Fenn read slowly. He read his page twice. When the room looked up, Harold was still looking at his page. Harold, Nathan said. Harold looked up. His expression had the quality of a man who had spent 30 years governing from principle and had just been shown that a principle he believed in was built on something he would not have chosen. The third founder, Harold said. He objected. Yes. This objection is documented. In his own hand. Yes. Harold was quiet for a moment. The compact, Harold said, has been the basis of every designation law defense this council has mounted for 30 years. I know, Nathan said. Harold looked at Nathan with the expression of a man who was about to say something that cost him something, and who was going to say it anyway because he was, before anything else, a person who respected evidence. The council's position on the bond law revision, Harold said slowly, was based on a representation of the compact that the founding letters do not support. Yes, Nathan said. A long pause. That, Harold Fenn said, is a significant problem. It is, Nathan agreed, and I am not raising it to embarrass anyone in this room. Everyone at this table has governed from the best available information. The founding letters were not available because they were misclassified for 3 centuries. No one in this room made that error. He paused. But we have the correct information now, and I think we should use it. Harold looked at him. Then Harold looked down the table at the rest of the council. Then Harold looked at his papers for a long moment. The revised compact framework, he said. The one you are presenting with the Southern Agreement today. Is it legally sound? Eli reviewed it. Harold did not visibly react to the name. He had not, Eli noticed, reacted to the name in several weeks. Something had shifted in Harold Fenn's posture toward Eli over the past month. Not warmth exactly, not even approval, but the specific adjustment of a man who was honest enough to separate his personal preferences from the quality of the work being done. Is it historically grounded? Harold said. The founding letters provide the best historical grounding of any interpact governance document produced in 300 years, Colin said. Harold nodded once, slowly. Then let us discuss the revised framework, he said. It was, Eli thought, the specific kind of courage that did not announce itself, not dramatic, not public, just a man deciding, in a council chamber on a Wednesday morning, that he was going to follow the evidence, wherever it led, regardless of where he had been standing the day before. The council meeting lasted 3 hours. At the end of it, a preliminary agreement had been reached on the framework for a comprehensive designation reform vote, a full revision that would go beyond the initial bond framework and address the underlying legal structure of how designation status was assigned, governed, and recorded across the entire Dominion. Harold Fenn co-signed the preliminary agreement. He did not make a speech about it. He just signed. Eli, watching from the side of the room where the advisors sat, wrote nothing in his notebook. He just watched Harold Fenn's pen move across the paper. Sometimes, he thought, the most important moments were the ones that looked like paperwork. The comprehensive designation reform required something that no one had attempted before, a full public record of what the law had actually done to people. Not the law in abstract terms. Not policy language or legal definitions. The human record. How many people had been registered against their preference? How many had lived under guardian status for years or decades? How many had been denied occupational rights? How many had concealed their designation under suppressants, and at what cost? Financial, medical, social. Nathan proposed it in the committee meeting, 2 weeks after the founding letters came to light. Eli said, immediately, that is going to be the hardest piece of evidence to build. Because the people who were affected may not want to come forward. Because the people who were affected have spent years building lives that do not include this information. Being visible was the danger. Some of them are still in danger. He paused. And because the administrative records that should document these cases were not kept in a way that acknowledges the harm, they were kept in the language of governance. Case numbers, administrative classifications. The people disappear inside the system's own description of them. Nathan looked at him. Is there another way to build the record? Eli thought about it for a moment. Not faster, he said, but more accurate. He picked up his pen. I want to review every designation case file from the past 50 years. Not the governance record. The case files. The actual people. What was filed on their behalf. What decisions were made. What the outcome was. You will have the access you need, Nathan said. It took 6 weeks. Eli and the 2 archivists he selected, Margaret Ellis among them, worked through the designation case files with the systematic attention that the material required and the particular care that it deserved, because these were not documents. They were people. They were 40 years of individual lives reduced to administrative decisions, and reading them with that understanding meant reading them slowly. What they found was not surprising to Eli. It was, however, documented in a way it had never been documented before. 4,217 designation cases reviewed, 3,008 of them resulting in guardian assignments that lasted more than 2 years, 1,412 involving occupational restrictions. 803 involving formal bond placements. Individuals matched to bond partners through the administrative matching system rather than by choice. 91 cases of documented suppressant use discovered by authorities, resulting in registration corrections, and in most cases, guardian assignment overrides. 91. Eli sat with that number. 91 people who had been caught, who had been visible when they could not afford to be, whose version of the same choice he had made had not held. He added his own case to the record, not as a number, as a written account, signed with his name, in the first official first-person testimony, included in a governance document in the Dominion's administrative history. He described 19 years old. He described the day he understood what registration would mean for his life. He described the decision to hide, the specific cost of that decision over 5 years, and the specific cost of a system that made hiding necessary. He wrote it the way he wrote everything, precisely, without embellishment, in the small handwriting that left no room for interpretation. He submitted it as part of the formal record. Margaret Ellis submitted a testimony as well, 3 pages, detailing 5 years of rejected applications, 2 years of living under a guardian's signature, and what it had cost her to finally walk into the Royal Records Hall and apply for a job without a form that required someone else's permission. Others came forward. Not many. The risks of visibility were still real for some people, and the comfort of publicly identifying with a system that had harmed you was still something that needed to be earned rather than expected. But enough. Enough to populate the record with faces behind the case numbers, enough to make the document something different from an administrative report, enough to make it a history. Eli titled it, The Designation Record, A Complete Account. Nathan read it in a single sitting. He sat with it for a long time afterward. He sent Eli a note that evening, 2 lines. I read every page. I am sorry it took this long to get here. Eli read the note at his desk in the archive, in the late quiet after the building had emptied. He did not write back immediately. He sat with the 2 lines for a while. Then he wrote, It got here. That is what matters. He meant it. The speech was not long. Nathan had written longer speeches. He had given formal addresses that ran to 40 minutes, covering economic proposals or border security frameworks, or the intricate diplomatic positions required by inter-pact negotiations. He was good at long speeches, clear, structured, evidence-based, the kind of address that gave people enough information to understand the argument without overwhelming them with the weight of it. This speech was 9 minutes. He wrote it himself, without Colin's input, which was unusual. He wrote 3 drafts and threw away the first 2, because they were the King's speech rather than Nathan's speech, and he had decided that this particular morning required Nathan's speech. The council chamber was full, in a way it had not been for a routine vote in years. Every council seat was occupied. The gallery above held representatives from all 7 of the Dominion's territories, including Philip Grange, who had traveled north specifically for the vote. Colin was at the side of the room with his journal. Eli was in the observers section, with Margaret Ellis beside him, and 3 other staff members from the review committee. Basil Ford was there as well, in his good jacket, slightly overdressed in the way of someone who had decided that this moment warranted good clothes, regardless of what the occasion technically required. Harold Fenn sat at the council table in his usual seat. He had arrived 20 minutes early, and had been reading the founding letters summary for those 20 minutes, with the focused attention of a man reviewing his own reasoning one final time. Nathan stood at the head of the table. The room was quiet. He looked at the faces in front of him. He looked at Eli. Eli looked back. Nathan spoke. He said that 300 years was a long time to hold a position. He said that governing from principle was the right approach, and that he had spent 8 years trying to do it, and believed in it, without reservation. He said that the principle of shared governance was the best feature of the Interpact Compact, and was not going to change under his rule. He said that principles deserved to be built on accurate history. He said that the accurate history of the designation law was now documented, and that the documentation showed something the Dominion had not known, because the documents had not been available. The law had not emerged from consensus. It had emerged from a political concession made under pressure at a founding conference, over the explicit written objection of one of the 3 compact founders, and it had been defended, for 300 years, as something it was not. He said that he was not assigning blame for this. The people who had governed before him had not had the founding letters. They had governed from the best available information. He was presenting new information. He said that the new information required a new decision. He said that the comprehensive designation reform before the council today was not a departure from the Dominion's values. It was the most accurate expression of those values the Dominion had produced in 300 years. He said that an incomplete record was just an organized version of forgetting. He looked at Eli when he said that. He said that they were done forgetting. He sat down. The chamber was very quiet for a moment. Then Harold Fenn cleared his throat and said, "The council will move to a formal vote." The vote proceeded alphabetically. Each member announced their position in the simple language the formal process required. For, against, abstain. Nathan had expected a clear majority. What he had not expected was 11-1. 11-4. 1 against, Raymond Gale from the Border Magistrates District, who was 64 years old and had been governing from one specific set of principles for 40 years and was not going to change them in a single morning, which Nathan respected even in the moment of it. And then Harold Fenn. Harold Fenn looked at the table for a moment after the other 11 votes were recorded. Then he said, 4. He said it with the deliberate weight of a man who had made a decision that was going to rearrange something in how he thought about himself and his career, and was choosing to make it anyway. The vote passed 11-1. The comprehensive designation reform was law. The chamber released the held breath of a very long process finally completing. In the observers section, Margaret Ellis put her hand over her mouth for a moment. Eli sat very still beside her. In the gallery, Philip Grange nodded once, slowly. Colin wrote something in his journal. Basil Ford, in his good jacket, was looking at the ceiling, with the expression of a man who was very glad he had worn his good jacket. Nathan looked at none of this. He was looking at the table in front of him, where the vote record now sat with 11 signatures. He thought about a war council meeting 3 years ago, where a younger version of this problem had first presented itself. He thought about a corridor. He thought about 3 seconds. He thought about a journal on the right-hand corner of a desk, and a sentence he had written at midnight that had changed everything about what he thought was possible. He stood and walked across the chamber to the observers section. He sat down in the empty chair on the other side of Eli and said quietly, "It passed." Eli looked at him. "I know. I was here. I know you were here." A pause. 11-1, Eli said. Harold voted for. Eli was quiet for a moment. "I saw." "Were you surprised?" Eli considered this carefully. "No," he said. "He is a man who follows the evidence. We gave him evidence." A pause. "I was surprised by the margin. I thought we would get 8. 9 was my estimate. We were both wrong." "Yes." Beside them, Margaret Ellis had composed herself and was looking at the vote record with the clear, steady gaze of someone who was filing this moment permanently. Eli thought about the 91 case files. He thought about the 6 weeks of reading individual lives inside administrative descriptions. He thought about a young man at 19 who had looked at a very clear future and walked away from it and spent 5 years building a different one. He thought about the journal on the bedside table, visible now, unhidden. He picked up his pen. He wrote, at the bottom of his notes for the day, 11-1. He closed the notebook. The new designation registration office opened on a Thursday morning in the Civic District, 3 weeks after the comprehensive reform vote. It was a civic office, 1 floor, clean, with a waiting room that had good chairs and natural light, and a front desk staffed by 3 people who had been specifically trained for this role. Not trained to manage omegas, trained to process paperwork efficiently and respectfully, for people who had been waiting for this specific appointment for anywhere between a few weeks and several decades. Eli went on the opening day, not as an official, not as a representative of the review committee, as a person who had a formal registration to correct, who had been technically registered as a beta for 5 years, and whose official record now needed to reflect what he actually was. He sat in the waiting room. He was the 7th person there. He looked at the other 6. He did not know any of them. They ranged in age from what looked like early 20s to what looked like mid-50s. One of them was reading a book. 2 were looking at their hands. 1 was speaking quietly to a companion who had apparently come for support, One of them, a woman in her 40s with the specific kind of composed expression that Eli recognized as the composure of someone who was managing something significant, caught his eye and nodded. He nodded back. His name was called. He went to the desk. He sat down across from a young clerk who processed the form with efficiency and no unnecessary commentary, which was exactly what the situation called for. Name, the clerk said. Eli Haynes. Current registered designation. Beta. Designation to be updated to Omega. The clerk filled in the form. This will take 3 business days to process. You will receive the updated documentation by mail, or you can collect it in person. In person, Eli said. Of course. The clerk completed the form. Is there anything else you need today? Eli thought about it. No, he said. This is exactly what I needed. He walked out of the civic office into the morning. The street outside was doing its ordinary things. A market stall, a woman with a shopping bag arguing with someone about the price of apples, 2 children running ahead of a woman who was walking very fast. Eli stood on the pavement for a moment. He had just done something that had been illegal when he was 19. He had just told an official, at a government desk, in a government building, what he was. And the official had written it down. And that was it. He stood on the pavement and waited to feel something dramatic about this. What he felt instead was ordinary. Not in the diminished sense, in the specific sense of something that should have always been ordinary, and was now, finally, allowed to be. He went to work. He told Basil about it over tea in the break room, in the same matter-of-fact way that he might have mentioned updating his contact information. Basil said, "Good," in the same matter-of-fact way, and then poured him more tea, and told him that the West Annex humidity report still needed a response before the end of the week. Eli told him he would have it by Thursday. He went back to his desk. Dr. Vera Holt's suppressant clinic opened in the same week in the medical district, 3 streets over from the original quiet office, where Eli had been collecting prescriptions for 4 years. The new clinic was not quiet and not secret. It was a registered medical practice, with a sign on the door and a staff of 4, and an appointment system that anyone could access through the standard civic health network. Eli visited on a Saturday. He sat in Vera Holt's office in her new space, which was larger and better lit than the old one, and said, "I wanted to say thank you for 4 years of very few questions and very good discretion." Vera looked at him with the dry warmth of someone who had spent 20 years helping people navigate systems that were not designed for them. "You are the reason this clinic exists," she said. "The reform documentation, the medical costs section. The committee used it to build the case for formal suppressant support. I provided the data. You provided the data and the context. There is a difference." She looked at him. "How are you?" "The adjustment dose is still holding," he said. "No drift since we moved to the new formulation." "That is not what I asked." He looked at her. "I am well," he said. "I am actually well." She nodded. "Come back in 3 months for a check." "I will." He left. He walked back through the civic district toward the archive, because it was a Saturday, and he did not officially need to be there on a Saturday, and he always went anyway. He let himself in through the staff entrance. He went to his desk. He opened the acquisition log. He wrote the date. He went to work. The letter arrived on a Tuesday and had been forwarded through the archive's general correspondence address. He opened it at his desk. The handwriting was neat and formal, the handwriting of a medical professional, which Eli recognized because he had spent years looking at his prescription records. The letter said, "My name is Leonard Vane. I was the physician at the Eastbridge Medical Clinic in 2019. I believe we met briefly. I have read the reform documentation, and I need to speak with you, if you are willing. I owe you an explanation. You can decline, and I will not write again." Eli read the letter twice. He sat with it for 3 days. Then he wrote back and said, "I am willing to meet. Tuesday, after 5, at the Civic Tea House on Arlen Street. 30 minutes. Leonard Vane was 62, gray-haired, and had the bearing of a man carrying something he had been carrying for a long time, and had decided, finally, to set down. He was already at the tea house when Eli arrived, sitting at a corner table with a cup of tea that he had not drunk. Eli sat across from him. For a moment they just looked at each other. "I am not sure you remember me," Leonard said. I remember the clinic, Eli said. I do not remember you specifically. I was not in a state to remember specific things. Leonard nodded. You were 19. You came in for a routine physical. The designation presentation was unexpected. For both of us. He looked at his tea. I completed the standard designation identification forms. I was legally required to file them within 48 hours. I filled them in. Eli waited. And then I looked at you, Leonard said. A pause. You were 19 years old, Leonard said. You had come in for a routine physical, and you had just been told something that was going to restructure your entire legal identity, and you were sitting in a clinic chair looking at me, with the expression of someone who was deciding very quickly how bad this was going to be. He paused, and I thought about the forms in my hand, and I thought about what filing them would actually do to a 19-year-old who had done nothing wrong. Eli was very still. I filed the forms, Leonard said. I filed them correctly, completely, as required by law. I put them in the courier bin at the end of my shift. He looked up. They never arrived at the registration office. Eli looked at him. I have thought about that for 7 years, Leonard said. About whether the courier made an error. About whether someone in the administrative chain made the same decision I almost made, and went further with it. He stopped. About whether I put them in the bin, and then took them out again. Or whether you put them in the bin and then took them out again, Eli said. Leonard was quiet. I genuinely do not know, Leonard said. I remember filing them. I remember the bin. I do not remember the end of that shift with enough clarity to be certain about what I did and what I only thought about doing. He looked at Eli directly. What I do know is that when your registration never arrived and you were never followed up, I was relieved, and I did not report the discrepancy. Eli sat with this for a moment. 7 years. This man had been carrying this for 7 years. Not the guilt of a definitive wrong decision, but the specific uncertainty of not knowing whether the thing he had nearly done was the thing he had actually done. Why are you telling me now? Eli said. Because the reform documentation named the 91 people who were caught, Leonard said, and I have spent 7 years not knowing if you were on that list, and I needed to know that you were not. Eli looked at him. I was not on that list, he said. Leonard closed his eyes briefly. And because, Leonard continued, I have been part of the human cost of this law, in some degree, for the past 20 years of practicing medicine. I have filed designation forms on 8 people. I know what happened to most of them. He picked up his tea. I needed to say this to someone who would understand what it meant. Eli was quiet for a moment. He thought about 19 years old. He thought about the specific fear of that period. The clinic, the waiting, the decision to run before the system closed. He thought about the fact that for 7 years he had believed he had moved fast enough, that he had been the only reason his registration had not been filed. I do not know what you did, Eli said. You do not know what you did. That is going to stay uncertain. He looked at Leonard. What I can tell you is what happened to me. I left the Eastern City the week after the clinic. I built a life under a beta registration. I worked in the Royal Records Hall for 3 years. And now the law has changed, and I am sitting in a tea house on a Tuesday, having a conversation that would have been illegal 2 years ago. He paused. Whatever you did or did not do at the end of that shift, the life that followed it was mine. I built it. Every decision was mine. Leonard was looking at him. I am not saying this to absolve you, Eli said. I am saying it because it is true, and because accurate records matter. He looked at his tea. If you want to do something with the weight you have been carrying, the new designation registry is building a medical support framework. They need physicians who understand the specific situation of people who have been on suppressants for years, the long-term clinical picture. He looked at Leonard. That is work that needs doing. Leonard was quiet for a long moment. I am 62 years old, he said. The clinic has a volunteer advisory board, Eli said. Dr. Holt is the director. Another pause. Would she consider someone with my history? She would consider someone with your experience, Eli said. I will not tell her your history. That is yours. Leonard sat with that. Then he nodded. He picked up his tea and finally drank it. They sat for the remainder of the 30 minutes, talking about medicine and administrative systems and the specific gaps in the new clinic's patient record framework, which Eli had thoughts about, and which Leonard, it turned out, had more thoughts about than either of them had expected. When Eli left, he walked back toward the archive through the early evening city. He was thinking about 19 years old. He was thinking about a courier bin and an uncertainty that would never be fully resolved. He went into the archive through the staff entrance. He sat at his desk. He opened his journal. He wrote about the meeting. Not everything, just the part that felt important, the part worth keeping. He wrote, "Sometimes the record has gaps that do not close. What matters is what gets built around them." He closed the journal. He went home. The Eastern Territories were the last formal challenge remaining in the Interpac governance framework, and they had not issued a challenge. This was, in diplomatic terms, its own kind of complexity. Philip Grange had been vocal, had written formally, challenged directly, and then engaged constructively when the evidence required it. The Eastern Territories under their leader, a woman named Diana Fallow, had been silent. They had not objected to the bond law revision. They had not cited the compact. They had simply observed. For 8 months, the Eastern Pac Coalition had watched the Northern Pac Dominion change a 300-year law and navigate the Southern Challenge and produce a comprehensive reform document and vote it into law, and they had not said a single word. Nathan discussed this with Eli one evening in the study. "Diana Fallow has not sent anything," Nathan said. "I know," Eli said. He was reviewing the Eastern Territories Governance Compact from 40 years ago. One of 3 things. Either she is opposed and is waiting for the right political moment to mount a challenge, or she is in favor and is assessing whether public support would cost her something internally, or she wants to do something similar and does not know how to start. Nathan looked at him. "What does the Eastern Territories' internal governance record look like on designation?" Eli said. Nathan called Colin. Colin reported that the Eastern Pac Coalition had the highest suppressant prescription rate in the Interpac region. It was not a coincidence. "Send a diplomatic inquiry," Nathan said. "Informal. Framework consultation. Offer to share the reform documentation as collegial exchange, rather than formal presentation." 3 weeks later, Diana Fallow's office sent a response. They would welcome a consultation. They preferred to receive a representative rather than documentation. At the coalition's capital. Nathan and Eli read the response together. "She wants to see who is carrying the message," Eli said. "Yes. Not who wrote the policy, who lived it." Nathan looked at him. "I would like you to go," Nathan said. Eli set down the response letter. "As the senior catalogist?" he said. "As the Director of Designation Affairs," Nathan said. "The position was formalized in the reform framework. You have been doing the work for 6 months. I should have given you the title 3 months ago." Eli was quiet for a moment. He looked at the response letter. He thought about 8 months ago, when he had been an archivist who was hiding what he was, processing documents in a back section, and keeping his head down and managing, with precise and exhausting discipline, the presentation of a self that was not quite accurate. He thought about walking into Diana Fallow's office as the Director of Designation Affairs of the Northern Pac Dominion, as himself. "Yes," he said, "I will go." He went. The Eastern Territories were different from the South in the specific way that places shaped by long winters were different from places shaped by sun, tighter, denser, with an architecture that leaned inward, and a population that moved through the cold months, with the efficient purposefulness of people who had learned not to spend warmth carelessly. Eli traveled with 2 members of the diplomatic affairs team. He carried the designation reform documents in a proper diplomatic case. He wore his good clothes and the title that was now his on paper, and had been his in practice for most of a year. He was nervous. He did not perform composure over the nervousness. He sat in the carriage for 2 days and was simply nervous, which was uncomfortable and also entirely reasonable. He arrived at Diana Fallow's governance building on a Thursday afternoon. Diana Fallow was 54, sharp-eyed, and had the specific kind of directness that came from governing a territory where winter lasted 6 months and people did not have time for diplomatic indirectness. She met him in the formal receiving room, looked at him for a moment with the assessment of someone sizing up not a policy but a person, and then said, "I heard you rebuilt the pre-settlement index." "Most of it," Eli said. "Still working on the transition period records." Diana looked at him. Then she said, "Come sit down, I have some questions." She did not ask him about the policy for the first 20 minutes. She asked him about the archive, the classification systems, the founding letters, the methodology for the human cost documentation. She asked with the genuine interest of someone who had a strong administrative background and cared about how things were built as much as what they produced. When she finally turned to the policy itself, she said, "I am not going to pretend the Eastern Territories have not been watching." "I assumed you had been," Eli said. "We have the highest suppressant prescription rate in the region," she said. It was not a statement she made easily. She said it with the flat honesty of someone stating a fact they would have preferred not to have to state. "I have known that for 12 years. I have been trying to determine what to do about it for 11 of those years." "What stopped you?" Eli said. Diana looked at him. What stops most people? Not knowing if there was a version of change that was politically survivable, and not having the historical evidence to make the argument properly. "You have it now," Eli said. "I have the documentation you sent." She looked at him. "I need more than documentation. I need to know how you built the political support. Not the legal argument, the political argument. How you got 11 of 12 council members." Eli thought about Harold Fenn on a Wednesday morning, saying 4. He thought about Philip Grange reading his ancestors' letters. He thought about Nathan standing at the council chamber door saying, "This meeting is over." He told Diana Fallow everything, not the policy framework, the story, how it had started, how it had nearly broken, how it had survived being broken, what it had cost and what it had produced. He told it the way he wrote acquisition logs, precisely, without embellishment, in the order it had actually happened. Diana listened. She did not take notes. She just listened. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The founding letters. Yes. If there is a similar documentation gap in the Eastern Compact. Your local archive records from the founding period are in the Eastern Capital," Eli said. "I can tell you exactly which collections to review." Diana looked at him. Then she turned to her senior advisor and said, "Open a consultation with the Designation Affairs Office, full documentation exchange, and schedule a follow-up meeting for next month." The advisor wrote it down. Diana looked back at Eli. "You came a long way to tell a story," she said. "The story is the record," Eli said. "The record is what makes the argument." She nodded. "I am going to need a few months," she said. "My counsel is not Nathan Cross's counsel." "I know," Eli said. "Most counsels are not." Something moved in Diana's expression. Not quite amusement, but close to it. "I will be in touch," she said. Eli went back to the Capitol. He went directly to the archive. He found Nathan in the study that evening. Nathan looked up. "How did it go?" "She is going to move," Eli said. "Not as fast as we did, but she will get there." He sat down in the chair near the fire. "She needs the founding records from the Eastern Compact reviewed. I told her which collections." "Can we send someone?" "I suggested Margaret Ellis," Eli said. "She is ready for field archive work, and the Eastern Compact records will benefit from a fresh set of eyes." Nathan looked at him for a moment. "You promoted someone today," he said. "I made a staffing suggestion," Eli said. Nathan did not argue the point. He picked up his document and went back to reading. Eli sat in the chair and did not pick up anything. He just sat. The city was doing its evening things outside the window. The fire was low. He was tired in the specific way of someone who had done something that mattered and had not yet had time to fully understand that it was done. He sat in the quiet study and let the tired settle. This was also something he was learning. How to be still without the stillness being about hiding. How to be in a room without calculating the distance to the exit. How to sit in a chair that felt like it belonged to him, even though it was in someone else's building. Because belonging, he had come to understand, had very little to do with whose name was on the door. He sat. The fire burned low. Nathan read. The city settled into night. 1 year after the comprehensive designation reform became law, Eli Haynes arrived at the Royal Records Hall at 6:45 in the morning. Not 7. 6:45. This was a change he had made 6 months ago, when Margaret Ellis had been promoted to senior catalogist for the Eastern Coalition Exchange, and her arrival time of 7 had meant that the building was no longer empty in that particular pre-7 hour that had once been entirely his. He had simply shifted 15 minutes earlier, without mentioning it to anyone, because the quiet first hour was not something he was willing to give up. He unlocked the staff entrance. He turned on the work lights in the back section. He hung up his bag. He went to his desk. The acquisition log was exactly where he had left it. The third-floor vault was waiting for the new intake he had been planning to complete this week. He opened the log. He wrote the date. He looked at the date for a moment. It was 1 year, almost exactly, since he had sat in this same seat and opened this same log and written that particular morning's date into the column that was always the first thing written. 1 year. He had been doing this work for 4 years now. The same desk, the same mahogany shelves, the same long slanting morning light through the narrow windows, the same rolling ladder on its brass rail, the same ventilation system maintaining the same correct humidity for the same documents that had been here when he arrived and would be here long after he was gone. None of it had changed. Everything around it had. He picked up his pen and began. He worked for 45 minutes before Margaret Ellis arrived. She came in with the energy of someone who had not yet been tired out by the day, which was a quality Eli had noticed in her from the beginning, and which had not diminished in the months since her return from the Eastern Territories. She had found what Eli had predicted she would find, a compact founding record with a documentation gap that, when properly filled, told the same story the Northern founding letters had told. She had spent 6 weeks in the Eastern Coalition archive building the case, and had returned with a report that Diana Fallow had used as the foundation of a council debate that was, by most accounts, going to result in a vote within the year. Margaret had not made a speech about this. She had written a very thorough archive report, submitted it through the correct channels, and come back to the Royal Records Hall and resumed her cataloging work. Eli had told Nathan, who had told Colin, who had told the Diplomatic Affairs Division, who had begun a formal exchange process with the Eastern Coalition. The record was moving. "Morning," Margaret said, putting her bag on her desk. "Good morning," Eli said. "The West Annex request list came in last night. 4 items for the Border Commission. I saw it. I pulled 2 of the 4 last week. They are in the active retrieval section. The other 2 need the 3rd floor vault. I can do the 3rd floor. Thank you." She went to the 3rd floor. He went back to the acquisition log. This was the texture of it. This was what a year of change looked like from the inside, not a continuous series of significant moments, but the ordinary accumulation of days, each one doing the work that needed doing, each one moving the record forward by the increment that was available. He was good at increments. He had always been good at increments. The archive had taught him that, years before he understood what else it was teaching him. At 9, Basil Ford arrived and greeted him in the specific, cheerful, exhausted way that Basil greeted people in mornings, and they discussed the humidity report, and the West Annex request list, and the new acquisition that had come in from the Border Commission's historical review. At 10, 2 researchers arrived for pre-scheduled reading room access. At 11:15, the staff entrance opened. Nathan came in. He was carrying a book, and had the particular expression of a man who had spent the morning in meetings, and had decided, sometime around 11, that the afternoon was going to be different. Eli looked up from the acquisition log. "Border Commission," he said. "Done at 10. The trade report is with Colin." Nathan looked at the work table. "I have 3 hours." "The light is on the right side," Eli said. Nathan moved the chair to the right side. He sat. He opened the book. Eli went back to the acquisition log. The archive did its quiet work around them. The ventilation system maintained its careful humidity. The researchers in the front section turned pages. Somewhere on the 3rd floor, Margaret's footsteps moved along the vault shelving. The afternoon light came through the narrow windows and moved across the floor in the long familiar lines that had marked the passage of afternoons in this room, for 200 years, before either of them was born. At some point, Nathan reached across the desk for a cross-reference card, and Eli passed it without looking up, and neither of them broke their concentration by a breath. At some point, Eli picked up his journal, the worn leather one, visible on the edge of the desk, not hidden, not buried, simply present, the way a working person's working tool is present, and wrote 2 lines about the acquisition he was cataloging. A note to himself about a cross-referencing structure he wanted to revisit before the end of the week. He set the journal back on the edge of the desk. Nathan glanced at it. He had seen the journal many times in the past year. He did not comment on it. Not because it was sensitive, but because it was Eli's, and it was simply there, which was all it needed to be. He looked back at his book. They sat. The afternoon moved. Around 2, Basil knocked on the back section door and told Nathan that a message had come from the palace regarding the 3 o'clock Border Commission follow-up. Nathan looked at the time. He closed his book. He stood and gathered his things. He looked at Eli. "Thursday?" he said. "Thursday," Eli confirmed. It was not a remarkable exchange. It was a logistical confirmation of a regular arrangement, the kind of exchange that people make when they have built a rhythm together, and the rhythm has become as automatic as breathing. Nathan left. Eli went back to the acquisition log. He worked until 5. He closed the log. He stood and collected his things. His bag, his jacket. The journal went in the outer pocket of the bag, visible, the way it had been for a year. He walked through the back section. He turned off the work lights. He paused at the doorway for a moment. The back section in the low afternoon was exactly what it always was. The shelves, full and ordered. The work table, clear for the day. The rolling ladder, motionless on its rail. The narrow windows, the last of the light moving through them in the long angled lines that would be different tomorrow, depending on the season, and the cloud cover, and the specific quality of that particular morning. He looked at the room. He thought about the first morning he had walked into this building, 24 years old, with a carefully constructed identity and a suppressant prescription, and a job application that had taken him 6 weeks to submit, because submitting it required becoming visible in a new place, and visibility was the thing he was always negotiating. He thought about 3 years of arriving before anyone else, and leaving after everyone was gone, and doing work that he was genuinely good at, and that no one in power looked at twice, which had been exactly the point. He thought about a corridor. He thought about 3 seconds. He thought about a journal on the right-hand corner of a desk and a line written at midnight in a different handwriting, and a morning he had walked across the palace courtyard to knock on a door he had no formal reason to knock on, because some things were more important than formal reasons. He looked at the room for another moment. Then he turned off the last light and left. He walked home through the city in the early evening, through the lower district with its familiar sounds, and its familiar smells, and its particular quality of being a place where people built lives that were not grand but were real. He let himself into his apartment. He made tea. He stood at the kitchen window and looked at the city below, the streets of the lower district doing their early evening things, the lights coming on in the buildings across the way, the particular quality of a city settling into the time between afternoon and dark. He thought about the acquisition log, open on his desk in the archive, the date at the top of the entry. 1 year. He thought about 43 Omegas who had registered in the first 2 weeks after the law changed. But he thought about 4,000 case files and 91 people who had been caught, and the specific number of a human cost that was now part of the permanent governance record. He thought about Margaret Ellis signing her name on an application form. He thought about Diana Fallow in her cold Eastern office saying, "I am going to need a few months." He thought about Harold Fenn's pen moving across a paper on a Wednesday morning. He thought about a man at a courier bin 7 years ago, and an uncertainty that would never fully close, and the life that had been built in the space that uncertainty had left. He thought about all of the things he had not known how to want until he had them. He drank his tea. He sat down at his small desk and opened his journal. He had been writing in it for 2 years. The worn leather binding had a new creak now, from having been opened too many times to count, and the pages were dense with the small handwriting that was the specific record of a person thinking through their days without hiding anything. He did not write tonight about the designation reform, or the archive, or the Eastern Territories, or the vote. He wrote about the afternoon light moving through the narrow windows. He wrote about passing a cross-reference card across a desk without looking up. He wrote about the specific quality of a quiet room where work was happening, and no one needed anything to be other than what it was. He wrote about what it felt like to sit in a chair and belong to it. He closed the journal. He looked at the city outside his window. The record was not complete. It never would be, entirely. There was always another acquisition, Another gap to fill. Another collection that had been waiting in the wrong location for the wrong amount of time. That was the nature of it. The archive was not a finished thing. It was a living thing. It grew. It changed. It required constant attention from people who understood that a record left unattended was a record that started forgetting. He understood that. He had always understood that. He stood up from the desk. He made a second cup of tea. He sat at the kitchen window and watched the city move into night, and he was not hiding from anything, and he was not managing anything, and the silence in the room was the silence of a place that was simply what it was, a small apartment above a tea shop in the lower district of a city that had changed more in 1 year than it had changed in 300. And he was in it, present, unhidden, himself. The kettle clicked off. The city hummed. He drank his tea. Tomorrow, he would go to the archive at 6:45. He would turn on the lights. He would open the acquisition log. He would write the date at the top of the first entry, and begin. The record was always being written. He intended to be there for as much of it as possible.